Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I want to welcome you to our 16th annual Inside China conference, Understanding China's Current and Future Automotive Industry. We're going to look at some issues related to talk about our group, talk about conference logistics, some sales and production information, as well as consumer insights. As I said, I'm the managing director of the Automotive Futures Group. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. So a full disclosure on that part. Most of our funding, or all of our funding, comes from our affiliate program, our research, and our 5 annual conferences. We'd always like to thank our affiliate members. We couldn't do this without them. We appreciate all the time and effort they give as our support. And we have IT organizations, OEMs, government NGOs, as well as suppliers and consultants. Our major research projects are our powertrain strategies for the 21st century project, our EV evolutions project that we started last year, where we're following the evolution of EVs in China, the U.S., and in Europe. We're posting most of that on our LinkedIn site. For our affiliates, we have a site on our website that is unique for them to be able to look at the consolidated information that we're putting out on LinkedIn. We're doing new mobility conferences, as well as some other things. These are our researchers. As you can see, Kara Alkire is here. She's on the YouTube video today. As you have questions, feel free to reach out to her. Sherry Netler is running the organization of the people who are coming in, and these are our student researchers. Some of them are carrying over from probably 3 or 4 years now, but we have some new freshmen who are joining us. I talked a little bit about our LinkedIn page. We appreciate everybody who is signing up for it. We have about 1,700 followers right now. So we encourage people to join and to connect with us and follow us. We're posting 2 to 3 times a week, usually things related to our conferences and also related to the industry overall. Our next conference coming up in February and our conference in April are going to be focusing on what we're calling the coming automotive supply chain. That is going to be focused on resilience, sustainability, and hopefully profitability, and also the issue of deglobalization of the automotive value chain, the nearshoring and reshoring to meet local goals and reduce risk. So, conference presenters, we got Keith Bradsher from the New York Times. He's going to be leading it off. He's going to be followed by Wao Wang and Connie Wu from Emleon University and Beacon Consulting. Then we'll take a break and go with Ken English and Pepe Zhao from RoboSense. And then we'll have David Coffin and Jeff Walling from the U.S. International Trade Commission talk about their research on the Chinese auto trade issues. So this is how we're setting it up. We'll do a 10-minute Q&A after each speaker. We'll take a break around 10:50. It lasts for about 25 minutes. Then we'll come back and do Ken and Pepe and David and Jeff Horowitz from the U.S. International Trade Commission. And then we'll, again, Q&As after each of those. And then around 12:40, we'll adjourn and have lunch. Post-conference, all the attendees get linked to presentations and the video. Affiliates get that, plus they get a document that provides a summary of the conference, of the highlights from the conference. The agenda, speaker bios, registration, sponsor opportunities, affiliate information, and upcoming events are all on our website. And we have, but for audience questions, we have a couple different ways of doing this. For the people who are here with us today, we have question cards, and Kara will be collecting those after each speaker, and then we'll look at those cards and ask those questions. But for the people that are online, please use the chat, and Kara will be checking that and sending those questions to me, and we'll continue the discussion by using those questions as well. So we encourage a lot of people to participate in the Q&As. It helps make create a discussion on the topic. When we look at the Chinese auto industry, we divide it up into three major groups. We have the joint venture manufacturers, we have joint venture owned brands, we have the domestic manufacturers, and one subgroup of the Tesla and Honda. So the main groups are the GAC group, the Honda, Kia, Nissan, PSA group, the Ford Chang'an group, the Toyota Volkswagen group with FAW, the BAIC group with Mercedes-Benz and Hyundai, SAIC with GM and Volkswagen, and Brilliance with BMW. These are the main ones that we're following. For the independent domestic brands, we're looking at JMC, we're looking at Photon, BYD, GAC, Geely, Chery, and Great Wall. And there's some emerging independent Chinese manufacturers. You have NIO, Li Auto, Xpeng Motors, and the recently bankrupt Weltmeister. So when we look at Chinese sales, here we're looking at Chinese sales from 2003 to 2022. You could see the things peak around 2017, but as all of us know, they're at around I think it was 2013 or 2012 that China became the largest automotive market in the world. Now, when we look at these vehicles, we're looking at commercial vehicles as well as pass cars and light trucks. You can see there was a dip in 2020 during the recession. It was a steady downward trend from 2017, but things picked up in 2021 and a little higher in 2022. So this is how they broke out in 2020, 21, 2022. As you can see, by including the buses and medium and heavy trucks, it doesn't give too much of a difference to what's going on in the marketplace. But it's interesting that the light trucks are actually selling more if they use the same strategy that the U.S. uses and counting even compact SUVs and all SUVs as light trucks, as well as minivans and pickup trucks. When you look at the top joint venture groups, this includes the for example, SAIC includes the sales for this is production from both GM and VW. Then followed by FAW, Dongfeng, Guangzhou, Chang'an, BAIC, and Brilliance. You can see that's a steady decrease in production from the other groups. But when you look at them over time, now we're looking at the top Chinese joint venture brands, but not including their joint venture partners. You can see some interesting differences. Here, especially when you're looking at what has happened from 2015 until 2022. Chang'an has grown a lot recently. Dongfeng, not so much for 2022. SAIC continuing to grow. FAW had a little better year in 2022 than 2021. Guangzhou again increasing, and BAIC increasing very little from 2021, 2022. But when you include all the top of the independent as well as the joint venture brands, you can see where things are headed. We've got BYD, Geely, Chery, Great Wall as the independent brands that are doing very well in the Chinese market, in particular in 2022. When we look at these independent brands, what jumps out at you immediately is the story of BYD, which is experienced tremendous growth in 2022, and I think we're going to see the same thing in 2023. But Geely continues to grow. Great Wall is pretty steady. Chery's continues to grow. Photon didn't have a good 2022. You look at the others, they're trying to keep up, but they're not growing at the same rate as some of the major ones. When you look at the foreign brands, where you only take out the Volkswagen out of their joint venture brands, or the GM from their joint venture brands, where they're only selling their brands, you can see the leaders for and this is for 2022, Volkswagen followed by General Motors. Toyota's then followed by Toyota and Honda. And a new group that we really started following fairly recently is Tesla. And when you look at these companies over time, looking at 2015 through 2022, again, in terms of production, you see some market decreases in Volkswagen and in General Motors. Ford has been struggling for quite a while in China. Decreases almost across the board, except for maybe Mercedes and maybe BMW a little bit. But Toyota and Nissan have been holding on, as well as Tesla has been growing. So you can see that it's been a rocky road for the foreign companies, and some dramatic differences from what they have done in the past for some of the companies. So when you look at the 2023 sales, now you're looking at January through October, they're at about 24 million vehicles. And now, as we said, China long ago became the #1 market for the auto industry, which is one of the reasons we keep doing this conference. If China was a number 10 in the world, I don't know if we'd be doing this conference. But when you're that far ahead in terms of the rest of the world of annual sales and production, you can't ignore them. So this is kind of where they're headed for, again, light duty and commercial vehicles as well. But you can't talk about, and our other speakers are going to be talking about this as well. I just want to talk a little bit about it. You can't talk about China without talking about NEVs, new energy vehicles. That includes pure electrics, PHEVs, and fuel cell vehicles. Here's the sales for 2021 through October of this year. You can see that what's interesting is that the continuing growth of NEVs, and they are looking at something like, and I think we're talking about 37% market share, something like that for these vehicles. But in the big sense of vehicles in China, it's still 2/3 are still gas vehicles. So you can see that though electric vehicles are growing, and Keith is going to talk about some of the reasons for that, besides just the incentives, which ended at the end of 2022. But it's a growing market for EVs. Some people may think that, oh, because of this, they're at 90%. No, they're not 90%. So there's work to be done still in China in making the transition. But they're the leaders throughout the world in terms of the transition to EVs or NEVs. So and as you can see here from this chart, that the new energy vehicles is steadily growing, and the other fuel types of vehicles is steadily decreasing. And then the other issue in China has to do with BEVs versus PHEVs. You tend to think of BEVs only in China. And it's true that most of the NEVs are BEVs, but there are particular vehicles that are high-selling vehicles that are PHEVs. Here you have the BYD Song, where almost what do you think? 80% of the vehicles are PHEVs. And then you start looking down where these darker red lines are. Those are all PHEVs. And you can see that there's many pure electrics, but there's also some pure PHEVs here. So it's a real mix in China. Again, dominated by BEVs, but PHEVs still are playing a role here. This is an area that I think some other countries are looking at and trying to decide. I think one of our powertrain conferences last year looked at the role of hybrids in the future. But the transition, it depends a lot on where you're heading and how fast you need to make the transition to EVs. Exports also play a role in China. In the past, we never had any slides in China on exports of vehicles, but things have changed. I think it happened in 2022, but here we are looking at January to July of this year and which manufacturers are the major exporters. And here you see SAIC Chery as the major exporters, followed by Tesla, Chang'an, Geely, Great Wall, and some of the others. So this is something that's really changing that has changed in China. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. I think some of our trade folks, as well as Keith, will talk about this as well. And the top destinations for those exports: Russia, Mexico, and then Belgium, Australia, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom. And some of our trade speakers are going to be talking about some of the trade issues related to exports as well. That's the export story. Some of the consumer issues, insights that we're looking at, and this is for 2023. This is from JD Power China. There's 3 major indexes. The Sales Satisfaction Index deals with the dealer experience. Initial Quality Index that shows problems over the first 90 days of ownership, and Dependability Index, problems with vehicles after 3 years of ownership. So when you look at this data, we've got some data from this year and last year, so we can do some comparisons. So when you're looking at sales satisfaction, in this case, high numbers are good. So the premium brands followed by mass market brands and domestic brands, and you can see that there's a decrease in sales satisfaction across those 3 different groups. And when you compare what we reported last year for sales satisfaction, you've got the premium brands increasing, the mass market brands increasing, and domestic brands pretty much staying the same. When you look at initial quality, and here in this case, low numbers are better. So premium brands followed by mass market brands and domestic brands. So the lower the number, the better. So you can see that there's some differences here that we would expect. And when you compare to 2022, the premium brands actually increased in a negative way. But the mass market brands decreased in 2023 compared to 2022, which is a good thing. And the domestic brands pretty much stayed the same. In dependability, again, low numbers are better in terms of problems per 100 vehicles. Premium brands, mass market brands, and domestic brands, some differences there. And compared to 2022, we've got premium brands decreasing, which is a good thing. Mass market brands increasing very slightly, as well as domestic brands. So this is the way consumers are looking at Chinese vehicles. So I think that's all I want to talk about today. I want to do a quick introduction to our first speaker, Keith Bradsher from the New York Times. So Keith Bradsher is Pulitzer Prize-winning Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. He previously served as the Shanghai bureau chief, Hong Kong bureau chief, and Detroit bureau chief, where we met. I think we met Keith during that stay when he was in Detroit. Gosh, Keith, when was that? Was it definitely in the 90s, right?
I was Detroit bureau chief for the New York Times 1996 through 2001. So a long time ago. And I lived in Ann Arbor for the latter part of that stay. And I have very fond memories of the University of Michigan. Yes.
Yeah, I think you were presenting at our conferences back then as well. Keith received his degree in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was a Morehead Scholar, and a master's degree in public policy with a concentration in economics from Princeton University. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you, Bruce. So, thank you all for coming to this event. I'm speaking to you from Shanghai right now. I'm at the Westin here. I just came down yesterday from Beijing. So I thought I would give a few examples of what's going on here, because I think a lot of people did not pay enough attention to what was happening in China, particularly during the pandemic. It became very hard to keep track. China almost completely sealed its borders from March 2020 through really early this year. And so people weren't seeing the level of development. China also threw out most of the reporters and put the remaining reporters under a lot of scrutiny and surveillance, and it became very difficult to report here. So people were not entirely aware of what was going on in the market here. To give you an idea of how hard it became to do reporting on the rapid developments in the auto industry here, I did get invited 2 years ago to an electric car factory in southern China, and flew down, spent the night at a hotel near the factory, went to the factory in the morning, and there was an unhappy head of the local municipal Foreign Affairs Department who told me that she had not been told in advance of this. She wasn't happy. Every step I had taken had been tracked since the moment my flight had landed. They'd declared a security alert for 500,000 people in the entire area, and they had activated their counterterrorism plan in response to there being a foreign correspondent going to an electric car factory, which was absurd, and there were police everywhere. So the level of visibility and has not been very good in the Chinese market, and yet a lot has been happening here that is going to have big implications for the rest of the world. So Bruce just showed you some of the charts for the past few years, but if I were you, I would look at those charts a little differently. Here are some key numbers. In the year 2000, China was only a 1 million car market. I'm not including medium and heavies here, medium and heavy duty trucks. It went from a 1 million car market, including light trucks, to a 27 million car market by 2017. And the expectation of Chinese and foreign automakers alike was that we would be well along at least 35 million and heading to 40 million by today in 2023. What happened instead? As you could see as you could see from that chart, that very steep growth suddenly flatlined and dipped a little bit. So where have we ended up? We have ended up with automakers having the capacity in China to build more than 50 million units a year. One of the recent numbers I saw was 59 million units of capacity in China. That's just incredible. If you think of a standard auto assembly plant as 250,000 units, that is a capacity of 240 full-sized assembly plants. or close to 240, not quite 240 because that 59 million is assuming a lot of three crew operations. But anyway, the point is that you have immense capacity. China has, roughly speaking, now the capacity to supply the European, US, and Chinese markets if it were not for limitations on mix, such as that they don't have much capacity in body on frame architecture, full-sized SUVs and pickups. But leaving that aside, the capacity here is enormous. One reason that you have so much extra capacity is that there has been a very fast ramping up of electric car output. And yet the ICE production capacity is still there and in some cases still expanding. So you have immense surplus capacity. When you've got a market really it's dropped down from 27 million to 23 million vehicles per year within China, and you've got capacity heading for 60 million units with more factories being built even now, mainly in electric cars. At the same time, the quality of these factories is getting better. So I've been going to assembly plants regularly, really since the start of 1996, when I became the Detroit bureau chief for the New York Times. And when I first came out to China in 2002, I immediately began looking at car assembly plants here as well. And at the time, they were terrible. I'll never forget, one of the first ones I went to in 2002, summer of 2002, was in Harbin, which is up north of North Korea even. It's in the northeastern corner of China. And I was shown proudly by a Chinese automaker their factory there. And you could see very quickly that their layout of their robots and so forth for the welding didn't really make sense. And I said, well, it's hard to see how you're really actually making any cars here. It sort of looked like they bolted these robots into the floor without much of a plan. And I said, I can't imagine you're really producing a lot of cars here. And finally, they reluctantly showed me through a door in the back right corner of that very large hall where they had their various imported robots. And sure enough, there was a whole very old-fashioned assembly line using almost entirely manual labor, still producing the actual cars in the back. They had real quality problems as well as production problems. So 5 or 6 years after that visit in Harbin, for example, I was at a newly purchased BYD factory. They'd bought it from a local automaker in Xi'an, a city in west central China that's mostly famous as the home of the Terracotta Warriors, or where the Terracotta Warriors were discovered. And that factory was terrible as well. There were boxes of parts stacked 4 and 5 meters high on either side of the line. You had no visibility down the line. They had a huge rework area at the end of the line. It was a mess. And when I went to the Guangzhou Auto Show a year later, and this is again more than a dozen years ago, I walked around with a couple of American executives, and they were saying they couldn't believe that BYD, among other automakers, was even showing some of the cars because they had such poor fit that they were showing them at an auto show. They would be hard even to sell on the US market because of their poor fit. But immense efforts have been made since then, and the quality of Chinese cars has improved tremendously. So I'm constantly jumping in cars using Didi, which is the equivalent of Uber for China. In fact, they bought Uber's operations in China. And really, the quality of the Chinese cars is excellent now. There is somewhat higher usage of a manual labor still, but the rate at which industrial robots are being installed nationally in China, not just in the auto industry, is extraordinary. China is now installing slightly more industrial robots each year than the entire rest of the world combined. And China is making many of those robots as well. So let's talk then about the biggest change of all and the most important, which is the rise of electric cars in China. So in 2009, I did a story on this out of Tianjin. Why Tianjin? Tianjin is the port at the mouth of the river that comes down from Beijing. And that happens to be the hometown of the person who was the premier of China at the time, the second highest ranking job in the country. And that was Premier Wen Jiabao. And he was a big booster of that battery industry in his hometown. They were trying very hard. He had set a target of 500,000 battery electric cars sold per year within the next several years. They didn't make it, but they did begin really taking some policy steps that would start to pave the way. For example, he set up a National Energy Council, sort of like the National Security Council in the United States. He made himself the chairman of it, and it included the country's top generals, the top industry leaders, the top government officials, with a real focus on energy security, energy independence. They have long seen electric cars as essential so that they would not need to import so much gasoline, so much oil from the Mideast and elsewhere across sea lanes that are mainly controlled by the US Navy and sometimes the Indian Navy. They've wanted to be self-reliant in energy as much as possible. And so they built very large solar panel industries, a large nuclear power industry, a large coal-fired power industry. And then they've been switching over to electric-powered cars as a way to use that electricity and make themselves self-reliant. By now, you have 38% of the Chinese market this autumn is either battery electric or plug-in hybrids. China is over the half the global market for electric cars now, and it makes the majority of them. And then China is even more dominant as you go up the supply chain. They're dominant in electric motors, they're dominant in batteries, and they are above all dominant in battery chemistry. There is a university in Changsha, which I just visited a few months ago, which specializes and has specialized for many years in battery chemistry. They churn out hundreds of chemistry graduates every year. And they graduates from there, for example, one of them is the chairman of BYD. Others play prominent roles in a number of the other big battery and chemistry companies. On the other side of the river from Central Southern University, you have a row of huge chemical factories. And China not only leads in the production of the chemicals, but they lead most of all in the fastest growing chemical, which is LFP. So as automakers are pivoting from NMC chemistries for their batteries to LFP, they're finding that China produces something close to 99% of the world's LFP. So and also on top of that, Chinese companies now also lead in the technology of how the batteries are produced. So they are, the Chinese battery producers have already almost entirely switched to prismatic architectures, whereas some of the other companies are still using various forms of soft pack and cylindrical designs. Trade then is going to be the area where we're going to see particular frictions probably in the next few years. So China was able to develop its auto industry very quickly by heavily protecting it from international competition. China had 100% tariffs on imported cars until 2001, although there was a little bit of smuggling. It cut those tariffs to 25% in 2001, well, by stages beginning in 2001, when it joined the WTO that year. And then in 2018, during the Trump trade war, they cut the tariff on imported cars to 15%. But that's still higher than, for example, Europe at 10%, and a lot higher than the US general purpose tariff on imported cars of 2.5%. Although the US did, under Trump and under Bob Lighthizer as United States Trade Representative, impose a special tariff of 25% on Chinese cars. But over the last 2 decades since China joined the WTO, it really put enormous pressure on automakers to localize production in China. It did it in a couple of ways. First of all, it required that if you wanted to build cars in China, you had to do it through a joint venture with a Chinese automaker. And so that made sure that you had tremendous technology transfer from the multinational automakers to their Chinese partners. And then also there was very heavily pressure that automakers had to localize production. And so, for example, VW was very proudly telling everybody a few years ago that they had reached 99% local content in their cars built in China. So one of the big questions for the West now, as China turns around and begins exporting very large numbers of cars after years of heavy subsidies, particularly for electric cars, is what rules will the West set? Will the West set similar rules requiring comprehensive localization? Will the West set rules requiring joint ventures with Western automakers so as to obtain technology transfer? What tariffs will the West set? You've seen the European Union begin a review of the subsidies for electric cars in China. The Chinese government is very eager to export these cars because they need to create jobs, and this industry has been a huge creator of jobs in China. And they have so much capacity that they really need to export to keep these factories full. So China is not enthusiastic about localization, and how that will play out will be one of the big trade stories of the next few years. Finally, if just to bring events up to this year, the big change that you're seeing this year is a change in financial policy by the Chinese government that has big implications for the auto industry. So if you went back to, for example, the first 9 months of 2019, before the pandemic, the net lending to real estate was about a little over 700 billion US dollars. So a lot of money going into building all these rows of high rises. But as many of you have probably read, China is now having a real problem in the real estate market. It's having a severe housing downturn. It had reached the point here where you paid 105 years rent for an apartment to buy that apartment. So the rental yield was only about 0.95%. By contrast, you were paying about 6% on a mortgage. So if you, for example, bought an apartment and rented it out, you were losing 5 percentage points a year. In 4 years, you were losing a 20% down payment. And this very leveraged speculative market is now run into trouble. So the real estate lending has come to a screeching halt. People are not buying homes nearly as much. They're not taking out mortgages. And instead of 700 billion in the first 9 months of 2019, now it's basically zero. And where did that 700 billion a year in new lending for first 9 months go? It was moved over to industrial lending. So in the first 9 months of 2019, lending for industry was $63 billion. First 9 months of 2023, it's up at 680 billion. So industrial lending has been an 11-fold increase in 4 years. And a lot of that is going into building more car factories and more car parts factories, particularly for electric cars. So there is a lot of investment, whether it is viable is not yet clear. With that, let me close, because I think Bruce wants to ask some questions, and I'm sure some of you may have questions as well. But I want to tell an anecdote that sort of is a vision of the future. So a couple of months ago, I went up the Yangtze River from Shanghai here, a couple hundred miles, to a commercial shipyard. And the reason I went there was to take a look at the enormous car carrier ships that are now being built in China. If you looked at the several years before the beginning of the pandemic, only 4 big transoceanic car carrier ships were being built worldwide per year, 4 a year. And these tended to be about 6,000 CEU vessels. CEU stands for car equivalent unit. It's how you measure the capacity of transoceanic car carrier vessels. It's based roughly on the footprint, length by width of a 1960 Toyota Corolla. So they're small. So if you have a 6,000 CEU car carrier, you figure you can carry 4,500 cars in it, probably fewer if you're shipping full-size SUVs. But anyway, so before the pandemic, there were only 4 a year being built, and they tended to be about 6,000 CEU. Chinese companies have ordered 170 of these to be built in the next 3 years, so close to 60 a year for each of the next 3 years. And the capacity is considerably larger. They tend to be, the ones I was looking at were 7,100 CEU vessels. And BYD has ordered 6 of by far the largest car carrier vessels the world has ever seen. Each will have a capacity of 9,400 CEU, which is immense. These are floating parking lots with a dozen floors, and they will be used probably to ship electric cars to the European market. So there's going to be a lot of capacity, but China needs to sell it. China really wants to create jobs. There's such a slowdown in the real estate sector. It needs to create the jobs in the auto industry. And so the question in the West is going to be how to compete with this very vibrant and successful Chinese auto industry. Thank you. And with that, maybe Bruce, do you want to ask some questions, or do you want to call on our guests for a question?
One of the questions I think you kind of touched on was, you talked a lot about data, and we use data for everything at different government levels, and within companies. How viable and how visible, how transparent is data in China? It's always been one of the issues, I think, especially I think in the banking industry, that they were like the WTO folks were very nervous about being able to look at the books of companies to be able to see whether they were actually reporting accurately what was going on in their companies. What's your view on this topic?
It is difficult to get detailed data in China. The Financial Times did a good analysis of the data series that are published by the Chinese government on various questions of economics. And I think something like 80% of the, as I recall, this has been a year now since that article ran, but I think it was 80% of the data series that were being issued a decade ago are no longer being issued. So you used to be able to get lots of detailed information on lots of individual sectors, and that's just not released anymore. The most visible one lately is that after youth unemployment reached a peak around 20% in early summer, China said it would no longer release monthly figures on youth unemployment. But there are a lot of other categories. China has also not disclosed very many subsidies. So there is a procedure under WTO that all member countries are supposed to release highly detailed information about subsidies, and there's not been much disclosure of that going on by China. However, China says that it is not subsidizing exports, and China has strongly denied accusations from the West that it engages in subsidies. As one last example on data, there has been a series of raids on Western companies doing corporate investigations or doing market research. And one of the categories for which they have accused people is for doing unauthorized market surveys even. So there's also been a new cybersecurity law introduced here this summer. There are elaborate efforts being made on data security. Some American companies have even told their executives in China that they are not allowed to fly out of China with their laptop computers, that all data must stay in China, so that if the executive goes to a meeting in another country, he can't take his laptop. He has to just go and talk to people there and come back, but not access any data in the country. Now, there are other people who say that is too extreme, and that the lawyers of those American companies are overdoing it. I don't know if that's being done in the auto sector. I know it's happening in other sectors, but some American companies think they need to worry about that. Others don't. But certainly, there is a strongly held position by the Chinese government that there should not be unwarranted or excessive release of information that might be damaging to security.
Very good, thank you. One of the issues that you touched on a little bit within the factory situation is labor costs. Traditionally, China historically had this fantastic labor cost advantage against the rest of the world. Now that changed probably. We've been tracking it, especially in comparing it to Mexico, probably within the last 5-6 years, something like that. That the price, that labor costs have increased in China. What are you seeing in terms of the auto industry from your experience?
It is going up steeply. It is going up most steeply in the skilled trades. So as a lot of these automakers have been installing a lot of highly automated robotic equipment, the people they really need are the electricians and other technicians who know how that works, who know how it's programmed, who know how it's installed. And they don't have enough of those. So the multiple of assembly line wages that you find for skilled workers, that premium, is definitely rising. And in those categories, they're still only earning half what a skilled trades worker in the US earns, but that compares to what may be a fifth of what an American assembly line worker makes for an assembly line worker. Where this really began getting going was with an important demographic shift that really can be marked to 2007. So there was a famous economist, Professor Lewis, who looked at economic development and concluded that wages in cities in developing countries tend to be flat for years and years, as long as there are always more unemployed or underemployed people who can be brought in from the countryside to go to work in the cities. And then when you reach what is called the Lewis point, which is when you run out of people sitting around in the countryside with nothing to do, and you start having to then compete for the existing supply of urban labor because there's not going to be any more urban labor, all of a sudden you get a very steep run up in wages. In China, you had a lot of factory workers, not skilled necessarily enough for auto factories, but still a lot of factory workers earning $100 a month for years. And in 2007, actually, they ran out of workers. They reached that Lewis point. And there was an agriculture ministry study that I wrote about at the time. They studied 3,000 villages across China, and they found that in 90% of those villages, there were no longer any more workers. I think 16 to 40 was their definition for the age bracket, who were able-bodied and able to move to the cities. And so you had run out of unemployed or underemployed workers in the countryside. They no longer were moving into the cities, and pretty soon you began getting a bidding up of wages for the least qualified workers, and that has spread into the more qualified areas, and now you have this rapid appreciation in wages.
So it's probably still not. It's still probably still cheaper than U.S. factory and EU factory labor costs as well. Still
so
less.
Skilled trades are a little less than half what they are in the U.S., and assembly line is about a fifth of what it is in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay.
So the multiple of skilled to unskilled to semi-skilled is higher here than it is in the U.S.
Got a lot of good questions from our audience. Why are they building more factories if they already have excess capacity?
There are a couple of reasons. One is that they are trying to convert the country with 23 million plus units of annual sales rapidly to electric cars, and they're building all new factories to do it. And so that right there, if depending on what capacity utilization you see, you can make an argument for building 30 million units of capacity of electric cars, or more, depending on what exports are going to be. At the same time, they've got all these gasoline factories, many of them held by the legacy automakers, and they are very reluctant to mothball them. The government is extremely focused on creating industrial jobs, and that comes from China's top leader, who is a big believer in industrial might. And he has refused to spend more money on what he describes as, quote, welfareism, unquote. So, which would be what we would call some form of social safety net. As a dramatic example, China finally introduced unemployment insurance for migratory workers early in the pandemic, because many of them lost their jobs early in the pandemic. China dropped its COVID-0 pandemic restrictions about December 8 of last year. December 31 of last year, they ended unemployment insurance for migrant workers. They said, sorry, tough luck, everybody get back to work immediately. So they haven't been willing to spend money on consumer or worker assistance programs. Instead, they have focused on lending money to create jobs by building ever more factories. And it is a mess in terms of profitability. But another reason that you're getting this factory construction, first of all, it creates jobs to build the factories. There's a lot of this is the state-owned banking system lending the money to build the factories. The state-run banking system is being encouraged to lend money for factories. It's a use of steel at a time when you have drops of as much as 80% in sales by the big real estate companies. So suddenly, in a country where a quarter of GDP was building housing, more than twice as much as it is in the United States, suddenly that came to an almost screeching halt. And you've got a vast construction industry that needs to build something, unless you want to have tens of millions of people losing their jobs. So they've turned them over to building factories, whether they need the factories or not.
Yeah, I guess one of the other questions, the follow-up on that was, do they have overcapacity in those battery, well, first of all, for the BEV plants, and also for battery plants?
I have seen the claim that they have some overcapacity in those areas, but they're growing so fast, it's hard to know what the path is, or whether I mean, the problem is that they've then got more factories coming online in that category as well. Yeah. But it is a fast-growing category. So my favorite number is that in 2020, electric cars plus plug-in hybrids were, I think, 5.4% of the market. And here we are running at 38% of the market 3 years later in the autumn of 2023. That's incredible. For a market to move that fast when it's a 23 million unit a year market is incredible. And they move with great speed here.
The China speed. And that's the story. One of my students now is working for Audi, and they brought her in to talk about how the Chinese are moving so much faster than the international companies. And it's fascinating. It's kind of similar to the IT companies, move fast and break things, and then learn from that and make changes. And that sort of kind of reminds me of, what's your opinion on the China speed story?
China does move indeed extremely fast. Their ability to build new factories, they can put up a new car factory in a little under a year and get it into operation, which is breathtaking. That's not including zoning time, but the zoning approvals are done in months. It's really, really fast. However, they also make big mistakes sometimes. That's the breaking things part that you mentioned. Right now, the big worry being expressed by a lot of economists is about where the real estate market is going. So when you have, in the US, 1/4 of household assets are in real estate, mainly the homes that people live in. In China, it's, depending on which estimate you believe, it's between 60 and 80%. That's extraordinary. And they have, because of a 40-year boom in building real estate, there is an incredible glut of housing. So the estimates I've heard are that they've got enough empty apartments for 300 million people. That compares with an urban population of about 800 million now. So there are some real problems coming up in the economy that we're seeing. We're seeing all these defaults on loans by the real estate developers. We're seeing existing housing prices down 18% in the last 2 years. That's a pretty sizable hit to people's net worth, and a lot of people are worried it'll get worse. So they do sometimes make mistakes, but right now they see, and so it's possible that now, instead of having massive overcapacity in real estate, they'll end up with overcapacity in industrial sectors.
Thank you. Now, one of the issues that we've seen very recently is the restriction of graphite by China. The question is, do you expect to continue to see China restricting critical materials on the world market, such as graphite? What are their goals what do you see as their goals for these restrictions, and what other materials do you see, if any, that might see these restrictions?
China has been talking big about restrictions on exports, and they tend to be ending up doing things like saying, well, you've got to register the shipments. But they have done fairly little in terms of actually blocking exports, with the exception of halting exports of rare earth metals for 2 months to Japan in 2010. Overall, while China is very, very unhappy with American export restrictions on semiconductors, the Chinese authorities are also very aware of how important it is to be seen by Western companies as a reliable supplier. And if you start cutting off shipments, that sends a powerful message to companies elsewhere that maybe you should not be as reliant on China. China wants the rest of the world to rely on it as the producer of industrial goods. It needs those exports. So over the past 30 years, China has very consistently managed its trade with the United States, so that for every dollar worth of goods it buys from the United States, it sells $3 or $4 worth of goods to the United States. With other countries, the ratio now is even higher. I think for Spain, it's buying $1 worth of Spanish goods and selling $7 to Spain. For Turkey, it's buying $1 worth of Turkish goods for every $10 worth of Chinese goods that are sold to Turkey. So when you're a large net exporter like that, it's very dangerous to start getting into the game with other countries of cutting off supplies of exports, because it undermines your ability to market yourself as a reliable supplier.
Very good, thank you.
So don't hold your breath for actual halts.
Okay. One of the questions that has to do with the issue of intellectual property that in the past was considered an issue in China. So the question is, do you think Chinese automakers are innovators rather than copiers in terms of product innovation in their vehicles?
In electric cars, Chinese automakers have definitely made a lot of progress. Now, even in areas like LFP, where Chinese companies dominate that particular battery chemistry, the early advances in LFP were made in the United States, but the US didn't really follow up on them. China has proven itself extremely good, and you could call it innovative, in figuring out ways to manufacture these materials at scale and at a reasonable cost. And that's a form of innovation. So it's not sudden new discoveries that come out of the blue, but it is innovative in the sense of making lots of small steps forward that together give you a better product.
You mentioned something in the past and earlier about the companies being rated, things like that, right? And I guess the question is, are there risks of staying in the Chinese market if you're already there?
General Motors sales here are down by half. Hyundai sales are down by more than that. Ford sales are down by, I think, more than that as well. So the risks here, I think, are more commercial than they are
Political.
security related. Yeah, I think that
It's more competitive.
China has gone out of its way to make American investors feel welcome, particularly right now. And there is a big effort to attract more foreign investment. And in fact, Chinese cities would love it if American companies came in and built more car factories as well as an approach to job creation. Mm-hmm. So I don't see it as such a safety issue here. I think it's more of a question of how do you make money in an environment when the financial system is shoveling loans out the door to people who want to build factories. And that is a difficult public policy choice. And at some point, it will be a dilemma for China as well, because the ratio of debt to GDP in China has passed the ratio in the United States. So this is a country where debt is piling up at an unbelievable pace. That's how they got to the point where the price of an apartment was equal to as much as 105 years rent. In the US, apartments tend to sell for 25 or 30 years rent. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to fall back to that level in China, because there are various reasons why people really value home ownership here. But there's just debt. There's a lot of debt in the system here. And now there's more debt in the industrial capacity area. And that means there will be some difficulties.
Following up on the EV plants, why can't the Chinese automakers produce EVs in their internal combustion engine plants?
Excellent question. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's sort of a legacy of the peculiar joint venture requirement. So they were requiring that the foreign automakers come in and set up 50-50 joint ventures in order to do assembly in China. And a lot, I think the majority still, considerable majority of the ICE capacity in this country is owned by the joint ventures. And now, as these Chinese companies have a lot of success in electric cars, they don't necessarily want to do the electric car manufacturing through a joint venture with a multinational. Mm-hmm. They don't feel as though they're necessarily getting that much out of it. So they go build their own separate EV factory down the block or across the city and invest it in additional capacity. On top of that, who are the real growth players in electric cars? BYD, yes, they make some. Yes, obviously they make a lot of plug-in hybrid electrics. That's their main area, so they are making small gasoline engines for that. But they are essentially a new player. It's not like they have they are ramping up sales and production very, very, very quickly, and they don't have they don't have the factories for it, so they have to build all new factories for it. So a big chunk of the incremental capacity is BYD. Then you've got NIO and XPeng and Li Auto. Those are three more startup electric car companies. In each case, they're building a lot of new car factories of their own. They're raising money on Wall Street to pay for it. SAIC is doing quite a bit in this area as well, and Shanghai Automotive, and they've chosen not to do the electric cars through their GM and Volkswagen partnerships, but to do it to some extent on their own as well. So that plus the fact that it's very, very cheap to put up a new factory here. There's just an incredible amount of trained, very low cost construction labor that knows how to put up steel pillars and walls and so forth. And if you're going and they're just willing to start over for a lot of these things.
Reminds me of one of my Chinese students. They were redoing an area in Ann Arbor campus on roads, and it was taking them 3-4 months. She goes, "Oh, that would have been done in 2 weeks in China." Couple of last questions for you, Keith. How do you see the current political challenges between the U.S. and China impacting the auto industry?
So I will be watching with interest what happens later today in California in the summit between China's top leader and President Biden. By putting in place the 25% tariff on imported cars, President Trump and Bob Lighthizer, his United States trade representative, really shielded the United States very considerably from this current wave of Chinese exports. So I can remember being at the Guangzhou Auto Show in, I think it was November 2018, and Guangzhou Auto Group, GAC, showed on a screen in front of us a great big map, and it showed huge scarlet arrows going from China to the United States, and they talked about how they were going to begin large-scale exports to the United States in the next few months. This might have been actually November 2017. And yeah, it was November 2017. And they had a couple of rows of prominent presidents of American car dealership groups at the front of their press conference as they talked about this. And they were all ready to start selling cars through them and do franchises and set up an extensive distribution network in the United States. And Guangzhou Automotive Group stopped that entire plan and still has not done it because the Trump administration put in place those 25% tariffs. Those 25% tariffs are adjustable. Catherine Tai, the current United States trade representative, has the authority to adjust them if she wishes. And the Democratic and Republican chairman and vice chairman, that is the top 4 people of the House of Representatives Select Committee on China, sent a letter a week ago to Catherine Tai asking her to raise those tariffs on Chinese cars from even higher than 25%. On the other, so the Biden administration has stuck with the Trump tariffs and has supported them and endorsed them and continued them without change. If there's a highly successful summit, will that make it less likely the U.S. will further raise tariffs? I don't know. That's a possibility, but we have to wait and see. And so I don't know on that. The real fireworks in the coming year will be in China-EU relations because the EU only has that 10% tariff on imported cars. They've seen in just 3 years, Chinese electric cars have gone from, I think, less than 1% of the European market to now 8% of the European electric car market. And yet China is bitterly opposed to Europe following the American example by imposing higher tariffs on Chinese cars. And so it'll be very interesting to watch if Europe decides to impose higher tariffs. And of course, China's argument is that if European countries, or for that matter, the United States, impose higher tariffs on electric cars from China, that is really hurting the world's progress on climate change because electric cars, if connected particularly to renewable energy, have lower carbon emissions. And China makes the argument that this is a violation of the free trade principles that the West has previously endorsed. And China makes the argument as well that this is limiting consumer choice in the West. So China is strongly opposed to increases in tariffs by the West.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that EU issue with our trade folks in the later part of the conference. Keith, I'm going to let you go. It's 11 p.m., 11:13 p.m. in
Yes.
Beijing. I want to thank you for your time, and we very much appreciate it. Very good insight on what's going on in China today and what you thought might happen in the future. Thanks again.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, next, all right, we're going with three sets of tag teams here with our next set of speakers. Our first set of speakers are Hua Wang is a professor of strategy and innovation management at an associate dean of Emlyon Business School. He's the dean of that school in Asia. His research interests in center on innovation management in the auto industry in China. He's the steering committee member of the JERPISA Research Network that I'm also a part of. And he receives his PhD from University Pierre Mendès in France. He's joined by his colleague, Connie Wu, who's a senior manager of global supply chain at several, was a senior manager of global supply chain at several multinational corporations in the auto industry for more than 20 years. She received her doctorate in administration from Emlyon Business School, and she's co-founded a community of practice, and she's also the founder of Beacon Consulting. Connie, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay. We're going to start, Hua? You want to start it, and then you're going to hand it off to Connie?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My pleasure to be here to participate this 16th annual Inside China Automotive Conference. Thanks for Bruce for offering this opportunity. In the previous presentation, we have already heard one name called BYD and see its impressive growth. So here we want to dig a little bit deeper to understand its product architecture evolution and the level of vertical integration, as well as those contributions to the competitiveness of the BYD. Let's move to the second page. So you see that this is a mixed work. Since what I heard from Bruce, that the majority will be the people from the industry, so I will make the theoretical or the academic part lighter. So the presentation will be organized in 5 parts. We start with the introduction on the context to understand the kind of the historical evolution on BYD, and to which extent that the company has received a remarkable development since the creation of the company. Then we followed with the research question and the research method. The third part, we can be a little bit light. Here is talking about the platform strategy and the dynamic capabilities, try to frame the or making the connection between the business reality and the sort of academic research field. Then I think that Connie will give you more insights on the case of the BYD by presenting the architecture part and the level of integration at the case of the BYDs. And the last part, I will step in to offer you the preliminary conclusions. So let's move to the next page. It was not the second time that I visited, talking about the kind of the study on the BYD. It is true that I personally more focused on the historical evolution about Geely, and that there was a book that has been published during the COVID period in 2021, named Geely Drives Out. Then here, I also visited, in the late 1990s, visit the assembling plants of BYD. At the moment, that they produce the ICE cars, and also during the various conference, meet the senior managers from the company. And the very recent visit was dated 16th June this year on the company. So to be very quickly give you a panoramic view, in fact, the company has 4 business units. It's not only car. There's the car business. There's the rail transit. So it's their way of interpreting the mobility. Even inside the company, they have the rail transport. The third part is the new energy, linking with especially the energy storage, for example. And the fourth part is the electronics. In fact, the foundation of the company in the very beginning was the production of consumer batteries, including for global players, especially for the laptops or the cell phones. So what you can see that the revenue has been increased in a significant way, and the compound annual growth rate in this historical period is about 56%. In terms of this auto segment, what we can see that the revenue of BYD in 2022 is around 5.4 billion euros. In terms of the car sales, in 2022 reached 1.8 million units, within which a small amount being exported to the overseas market, as what Bruce has presented. In the overseas market, SAIC was the number 1, and BYD is still on the later, the maybe 6th or 7th exporters from the perspective Chinese indigenous car brands. And a projection about the next year, in fact, this year, it is expected that 3 million cars will be sold. And with the first 10 months, already the figures is about 2.37 million units. So it is for sure that will exceed the result of last year. Let's see the next page. Here we want to raise a question. In fact, here is try to dig deeper to understand where comes from the significant growth of BYD. So we try to raise the question that behind this remarkable growth, how are the evolution of product architecture and the level of vertical integration recognized as a source of the company's dynamic capability. In the previous presentation, there's the mention about the capacity of a large volume production so as to lower the costs. While in the hybrid cars and electric vehicles, there's the logic of designing those cars, then move to the second stage about the mass production. So here we more focus on the first, how those cars are designed and how it is the evolution from the reverse engineering or sort of the copying of the popular Western car models towards a more forward engineering concept on the production. So here the research method is the case study based on the first and second hand data. Let's move to the next page. So in terms of the literature review, in fact, there is a cross between the platform strategy. Here it is mainly talking several keywords. I think that the industrial people are pretty familiar as well. The modularity, the platform strategy, which contribute or make the compromise between the volume driven and the personalized the cars. It's a trade-off between these two. The second stream of the literature review is talking about the dynamic capability and the flexibility. So one of the sources is about the platform, how the platform can, increase the creation of the platform for the car can build the capabilities of the company. Then the second is about the flexibility. That means the interaction between car makers and the consumers. But this part is not the main focus. Then we can move to the next slide, talking about to give you a current portfolio of the vehicles. So in fact, this is about the the recent portfolio with the mixture. Let's move to the next page. With the mixture of the SUVs. Connie, could you please move to the next page? So with the mixture of the SUVs, passenger cars. So the first category on the green is the SUV cars, with two categories, the EV and the PHEV, right? Then the second part is the sedan of different size. Then the others is the MPV. So the green part is mainly the brand is the Dynasty. Then there is the Ocean, also composed by electric vehicles and the PHEV. The sole models that Bruce mentioned is not exposed in this portfolio. Then the third part, you can see a picture of the car. It's a car roughly $150,000 US, premium brand, recently being created, and it generates lots of buzz, also produced by BYD. Okay, so I leave the floor to Connie to continue the explanation from the perspective of the product architecture evolution and the level of the integration, especially the comparison between or comparison with some leading car makers, including Tesla. Connie, please.
Thanks, William. Because I keep get the alert that my network is very weak, so I just keep the camera off. Sorry for that. This part is about the BYD case study from the architecture innovation perspective. So we can see that the
move to the next page. Next slide.
Yeah. I just have a little bit more words about this slide. Since we can see that the BYD product matrix just covers the mainstream models fitting with the diversity of customer segments and spatial needs, we can see that the Dynasty series just focus on the mainstream, includes DMP and DMI platform. But the Ocean series is different from the Dynasty, target for young people. At the 2023 Shanghai Auto Show, BYD premium EV Yang1 attracted plenty of visitors and media attention. Yeah, as shown in the previous slide, BYD entered the automotive industry in 2003, starting with the ICE cars with a strategy of reverse engineering. Its a superior understanding of the niches enables BYD to fit specific segments and spatial needs successfully through a range of products. As we can see here, its F3 benchmark Corolla of Toyota, F0 benchmark Toyota Aygo, S6 and M6 benchmark Toyota Previa, F3R benchmark GM Buick, HRV, S8 benchmark Benz CLK 476ZQA with a 1.5 turbocharger engine, benchmark Volkswagen EA111 with a turbocharger 1.4. Since 2008, its DM series plug-in hybrid EV hit the market with architecture innovation, but high-level vertical integration. We can see that DM 1.0 is equipped with a pure electric endurance of 100 kilometers. But when it moves to DM 2.0, targets 542 technology. That means aims to accelerate 100 kilometers within 5 seconds with 4-wheel drives, fuel consumption less than 2 liters per kilometer. When moved to DM 3.0, it includes the 2 platforms. DMP aims at high performance with 3 driving modes. DMI aims for low fuel consumption. The BYD pure battery EV platform has been developed since 2009. The 1.0 generation focused on the core technology of a battery, motor, and electric control system. The represent car model is E6. 2.0 generation since 2016 focus on in-house modularities named 33111. That means 3-in-1 powertrain, 3-in-1 high voltage charging system, 1 PCB for a dozen control modules, 1 rotatable screen outfitted with the D-Link intelligent system, 1 long-range battery. The represent car model is the Dynasty series. The 3.0 generation since 2021 is a higher level vertical integration with the software and hardware decoupled operating system BYD OS. It's more open for value co-creation with external stakeholders. BYD announces industrial sharing of the E-Platform 3.0 and Blade battery. The represented car model is the Ocean series. The other days when I was chatting with some professionals from the automotive industry in China, I was told that the BYD cars, they like the BYD car because it's very easier for much more easier for the interchangeable, because it's open to the external developers and the stakeholders to for the service providers. In 2023, BYD launched its premium segment E4 platform. Yang 1, U8, and U9 belong to this segment. In 2022, Boston Consulting Group took an A-class sedan with 50 kilowatt-hours battery as an example, comparing the top brands' integration. BYD ranked the highest vertical integration with the significant cost advantages. We can see from this chart that batteries, motors, and the electric control systems are deeply integrated and keep the core technologies in-house. So Tesla is close to BYD about the integration performance, but BYD ranked it the highest. Okay, William, I pass the table to you again.
in terms of preliminary conclusions, as what we can see from the introduction of Connie, that in fact BYD experienced from the product category, the company both produced the ICE cars, PHEV cars, and the EV cars. So in the early stage, we can find that BYD evolved was in the category of reverse engineer, right? And then when shifting towards PHEV and in particular electric vehicles, it is started the forward engineering by creating its own platforms. On top of that, there is a culture of high-level vertical integration in the company. So that is why on the second bullet point, as I underline that it's a kind of the BYD's DNA, because the tendency of high-level vertical integration dated back to the manufacturing of the battery, dated back to the ICE car manufacturing, and to be continued in today's electric vehicles. And this type of high, or by now the highest level of integration, is a unique capability of BYD. And I personally think that it will be very difficult to be copied by the other car makers, because the company's historical evolution is unique, starting from the battery production, and then accumulated the know-how since the 1995. So the learning curve was pretty long to be imitated or to be copied. From this case, we can further extend to understand that whether besides the unique point we have mentioned, what are some other common points that we can find or can be shared by some other Chinese car makers? At the collective level, as what we have, Bruce has been exposed, that China it has become the largest country to produce electric or hybrid vehicles. So this type of market size is important, that allows the volume production and the sales, and thus to accelerate the payoff of the forward engineered platform design. Then the second, it is true that it is not written here, but the government national industrial policy made a big boost on that. And when we're talking about forward platform design, it is not only the case of BYD. We can find from other companies, including, for example, Geely and among the others. The third interesting point, that it also makes difference at the collective level compared to the traditional global leading car makers in the stage of ICE, is that in the pretty early stage, several car makers, including BYD, including Geely, including CIIC, the cartel, they announced that they are ready to share the platform with other car makers. So it's a kind of an open architecture mindset and culture at the collective level to be found in the market. This is one thing. While whether the others, other rivals, Chinese, are ready to use their platform to produce their own cars, it's another story, and it still take time to make the observation. So the last point is about what we describe as a kind of the reverse technology transfer. It means that in the stage of electric vehicles, we find that technology know-hows are on the stage of transferring from China to some global players. So making several examples like the BYD's technology transfer at the Denza. In fact, this is the joint venture with Benz without too much success, commercial success. And by the end, in the last year, BYD took the majority share, almost 100% on that brand. And then what we can see also Volkswagen's acquisition of 5% of XPeng in aims of also having the acquisition part of the technology. And Stellantis, the acquisition of 20% of Leap Motors is a kind of the reverse exchange between technology and the market. So here is Chinese technology and European market. So those new landscapes are still need to be observed as what we have jointly said that China, especially China-Europe relationship in the new energy vehicles are on the front line of our both academic and industrial observation, because the China-US barriers by now is still very high for the moment, and we don't see significant signs even in the coming days. There will be a significant change, right? The current announcement is more on the climate change agenda, decarbonization, those on the topic. Thank you very much, and I stop here, or our presentation stop here.
Thank you very much, William. When you look at the different platform strategies that you were talking about for BYD, in terms of their platform strategies, the dynamic capabilities, and the ecosystem and the partnerships, what did you see that was unique about their approach compared to other companies?
The unique point is what we have shared is that a very high level of vertical integration. That is the difference part, right? It is exposed also by the BCG report on the value chain, the key value chain for the electric vehicles. I still remember that in the late 1990s when I visited the ICE cars assembling line, it was really amazing to see that how many components being delivered right on the right side of the assembling line and to be assembled on site. So this way of the production is a very particular way, based on my visit of different brands assembling line like General Motors, Volkswagen, Chinese car makers, etc. And you can see that they're even including the chairs or the cockpits, cables, lots of components were produced by the affiliated company by BYD. And this type of three-step of historical industrial evolution from the production of the battery for consumer electronics to ICE cars, then combine the know-how of the battery technology and the car manufacturing technology together for the PHEV and the EV cars. That's something unique. And what does not yet change, or what has not yet been changed, is that philosophy of a high level of vertical integration. In the second stage, it was true that it's sort of the disadvantage to a certain moment when you want to continue to have so many different models copying from different car makers' models, right? Mm-hmm. Well, suddenly the strategic decision moved to the electric vehicle part, convert that disadvantage of high level of vertical integration towards the advantage. And that partially explains the sudden surge of the sales of the cars, especially in the PHEV and EV cars.
And if we take a look at the automotive context, we may still remember that BYD entered the automotive industry in 2003, and that's a starting point for the battery R&D stage. I'm not quite sure whether you ever heard about the 863 program. That was a program approved in 1986, in March of 1986, and for the research and development of a new technology. And the new energy vehicle is one of those technologies. And BYD entered the automotive industry in 2003. By that time, the research and development project just started. So BYD was one of the first wave. Just a little additional comment.
Very good, thank you. Now, I'm assuming that the biggest cost advantage in the strategy of BYD in terms of vertical integration is by developing your own batteries. Batteries are probably the most expensive, or one of the most expensive components of an electric vehicle, and therefore the being able to you don't have to share. You don't have to buy you have to buy materials, but you don't have to the battery itself. You don't have to share the cost or pay for those batteries. Is there anything else besides the battery that either of you see as a particular cost advantage in the more vertically integrated system?
Connie, you want to answer that question, or I take that part?
I answered with some points, and you please add more. When the F3, when BYD launched its F3, I was working at Delphi. That Delphi is American tier 1 supplier. And for the F3 vehicle, Delphi was supplying the braking system. It was I'll say sweet suffering because when BYD provide a request of a quote, the forecaster says a number, but the actual delivery is more than 200%. How comes like this? I personally think there are two points I'd like to mention here. One of the two is about the supply chain development, because of new phase just entered the automotive industry. It's not very easy to be recognized as a knowing brand. So it's very difficult to attract matured supply chain to support it.
Mhm.
And after analysis of a make or buy in detail, it was decided only for those critical safety components like the braking system, BYD just bought from outside. For the other parts, including the mold designing and mold manufacturing, they do everything in-house. That's a very vertical integrated.
To complement Bruce, you see that in the presentation, there's another level of high level of integration. You have mentioned about the battery, and then in our presentation we have mentioned about the integration of 3 powertrain parts together: the electric motor, electric control unit, and this decelerator. So this is also something very unique, because if you want to buy from the market, those are 3 components separately. But in terms of constantly chasing for the performance, gaining the space, reducing the costs, BYD worked very hard to make those previously 3 components into one. The same thing is the interface between the hardware and the software that we mentioned about the e-platform 3.0. So there is also a very close, in-house coordination between the software and the hardware part to be coordinated, so as to increase or improve the performance. So you see that that is something we cannot, by the moment, found from some other companies to, for example, concretely integrate those 3 core components into one, right? So that is another observation that I personally found that it's another proof to say that in terms of forward engineering, it is not only, it's no more say in a traditional way to say let's make forward engineering, making a platform, but we still put those 3 components as the others. No, they are integrating them into one piece. So that is another very typical example about the level of
very nice and a potential cost advantage. Last question for you. This gets into the open architecture story, which is a relatively new thing for BYD. We know that from our experiences that Chinese cars are and drivers and riders in cars are very electronically connected, and the companies, and it sounds like from the open architecture that they're willing to allow companies to use their system to, of course, if they okay it, but use their system to innovate things that are connected between the driver, passenger, and the vehicle. This is a very interesting story because it opens up so many opportunities for these manufacturers to be able to bring things to the consumer that other companies may not have, which is very cool for that situation. But the question then is, how do the different manufacturers compete with each other if they're all using these very similar, or maybe the competition is that we allow these things whereas other companies do not. I think you were mentioning it that the foreign brands are really lacking in terms of opening up their architecture for different applications that are connected to the consumer, for the consumer. Can you talk a little bit about some of the differences you see in the Chinese view of or how they interact with consumers on this level?
Yeah, I think that the first I want to answer the industrial logic, then towards the second level is about the interaction with the consumers.
Sure.
What I see is that when here talking about open architecture, it is still in the early stage of individual corporate initiatives. It is not like the PC industry that car makers, car makers make a kind of the agreement to become a kind of industrial standardized interface, right? You see that PC industry is a kind of plug-in mentality, which is not true. So when we use the word of open architecture, the caution is to deeply or clearly define what's the meaning behind and what's the phenomenon behind. So what I want to say is there's a tendency to make the things open architecture, but it is not an industrial standard yet. First point. Second point, their logic is about the more people are sharing with our platforms, the lower R&D cost or sheer production cost can be generated. That is also the case if we further extend is to questioning profoundly about what is a car in the future. If we say that it's a big smartphone, that gives us a kind of an easier understanding. It's see that it will be a combination of the hardware and the software. Combination of the hardware with the hidden part that cannot be seen, and the hardware that can be personalized. So you see that it's a multiple, at least 3 dimensions. So that is why when I meet the founder of the CIIC, in fact, the CATL company, right, the global leading company, because we jointly delivered a training program together. So in fact, their company's strategy is expanding from a simple battery manufacturing towards a platform that is equipped with battery, electric motors, and controlling system. So what they literally say is that we produce the bottom part. You car makers taking care of the upper part. Mm-hmm. That means we taking care of the hidden part of the car, of the electric vehicles. For the resting, we don't compete with you. Mm-hmm. So you see that is another logic of the willingness to increase the commercial value from battery to battery pack to the platform, like the EV chassis, right? Then letting the car makers intervene with the consumers they are targeted, because they can integrate it, a personalized shape of the electric vehicles on the upper part, the visible part, the smart entertainment systems inside, mm-hmm. and personalize the softwares to make the differentiation maybe in the future car vehicles. So that is my personal observation and interpretation.
Very good, thank you.
And I'd like to give 2 examples to echo William's answer. One of the example is about the BYD E 3.0. That's for the Ocean series, and Ocean series is targeted for young people. And with this E 3.0 platform, BYD decoupled the hardware and the software and making it very easier for the continue value co-creation with external stakeholders. This is one example. The other example, to answer the question from Bruce about the the car makers competition with each other. There was a very very a popular cited words, keep the solar in own hands. That's a very popular cited words in the China's automotive industry. That means, okay, the OEM, they keep the core technology like the battery management system, the electronic control system, and the vehicle control system, and the body domain. Those are the core technologies that car makers, they keep it in own hand. Before the intelligent cockpit, they keep open innovation with the external service provider. As the young people, when they're driving, they like to also enjoy the entertainment, like the Himalaya, like the Taobao. They almost can do everything in car.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
good.
These are the two examples to echo. Yeah.
Very good. William and Connie, I want to thank you. Very good
Pleasure.
information about
Yeah.
about BYD, things that we didn't know before. It's always a good thing. And we will talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Let's take a 15-minute break. All right, welcome back for a second half of our conference. We're going to be looking at LiDAR and also trade issues with China. The LiDAR story is interesting because it's we're talking with the presenters are a Chinese company now that's in Michigan and building and selling LiDAR here in Michigan. So I'm going to start out with Ken English. He's the Senior Director of Automotive at RoboSense, where he spearheads the expansion of business partnerships with North American OEMs. His educational background includes a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and MBA, both from Oakland University. Ken also boasts 3 decades of industry experience. His professional journey has included diverse roles in manufacturing engineering to product engineering, program management, and business development. In 2006, Ken ventured into collaborating with Chinese enterprises as the industry focused on low-cost country sourcing strategies, and he resided in Shanghai from China from 2015 to 2018, actively contributing to growth initiatives. He's going to be joined by Pepe Zhao, who is the president of North America of RoboSense. Pepe has over 15 years in the automotive sector. He spearheaded the global expansion of Chinese enterprises and facilitated the growth of EU and US companies in China. He's worked in key roles both in the US and China for companies like Ericsson, Flex, Valeo, and Changan Automobile. Mr. Zhao earned his master's degree in economics from Michigan Technological University and a bachelor's degree in management from Hefei University of Technology in China. Please take it away, Ken.
Thanks for that introduction, Bruce. And welcome. Thank you, everybody, for hosting us today at RoboSense. We are really excited to have the opportunity to talk about LiDAR, talk about a new technology. What I intend to review today is a brief definition, some technical details, but I'll keep it to a Cliff Notes version of what LiDAR is. Give an overview of our company, start transitioning this new technology into its support as one of the sensors in autonomous driving, augmentation, as well as advanced driver systems. The real focus that I think has relevant context to automotive futures is the fourth section, which would be the automotive LiDAR market. LiDAR markets, particularly automotive. We'll look at a lot of forecasting information. We'll also go back and see where we've been over the last couple of years. Take a look at the competition of the suppliers and where the OEMs are sourcing some of these. Brief history starts with the invention of the laser. Without laser, you don't have LiDAR. In 1971, LiDAR was used to start measuring the lunar surface by Apollo 15. 2006, Velodyne, which is now part of Ouster, created the first 64 beam LiDAR, which really started evolving things with accuracy and resolution. 2010 saw the first automotive grade LiDAR, automotive grade being one that can, I'm going to use the term automotive grade, a consumer automotive, something that's going to meet the warranty requirements of automotives in terms of 10 years, 150,000 miles, those types of things. RoboSense was founded in 2014. And then in 2016, you have the advent of flash technology. We'll get into some of those details. So other than, you know, this history in laser triggering the advancement of LiDAR, the other more indirect contributor is the advancement of semiconductors. The ability to process the extensive amount of information is known as Moore's Law, approximately doubling the amount of transistors on devices every 2 years. That was Moore's Laws in 1970, the early 70s. It was postulated, and to see that it's actually holding true here into the 2020s, mid 2020s, is quite spectacular, as we're reaching 10 billion transistors per device. The second major, more indirect augmentation of LiDAR is the semiconductors. LiDAR, it's an acronym for light detection and ranging. Very similar to radar, using radio waves, we're using light waves. This first slide is going to discuss the first two major portions, which is going to be your light detection portion of this. So the transmittance of a laser beam, two different methods. I was already questioned about this at the break. Are you pulse or are you continuous wave? You're getting into a lot of physics and science here that's going to delineate between the two, both having advantages over the other, and different considerations that result in the ideal solution for each application. That gets the transmission, which is the light. Well, now you send out light, you need to detect it. You have a receiver that's going to sense these returns via pulses or echoes. Typically, you're measuring photons. Very simple simulation of like a single point is you're emitting this laser pulse, it hits an object, it returns. Based on the speed of light being a fixed constant, and measuring the time distance from emitting to receiving the photons, dividing that time by 2, you got, well, by doing the math, you can clearly, accurately determine the distance that object was away from the emitter. A very simple example of this, I'm a big golfer, is your rangefinder. Single point is pointed at the stick. Okay, I'm 145 yards away from the pin, based on that laser reflecting off of the flagstick. Getting into the you know, after covering the transmitting and receiving side, to make a really effective LiDAR, we need to scan these. We need to have these these beams scan a field of view. In doing that, we need to process the signals, the return energies of all of these laser pulses coming back. We need to acquire a ton of data. The fourth element of a LiDAR is the control system. You have to control and integrate all of these different elements at the same time, which makes this one of the most high-tech, complicated devices I've worked on in my career. So you have mechanics, you have electronics, you have a significant amount of optics. What I want to demonstrate here is you're seeing some video of our automotive grade LiDAR that's on the table here, having a stationary beam that is reflected into a microelectronic, a MEMS mirror. So what's not shown in this image is a significant amount of lenses and filters, but the light pulse going out is the red beam. It hits the object. It's time, the speed of light comes back, it returns to that same MEMS mirror, hits another reflecting mirror, but now it hits a transition mirror and goes vertical and back into the receiver. So we have a transmitter and a receiver in a very small package. I think I went too far. Mouse is okay. Yeah, so taking it now to a higher level of what are the different types of LiDAR. You have topological, bathymetric for measuring underwater, obviously flying in airplanes, measuring surface of Earth or moon, etc. In the static side, these are devices that have very high resolution, high accuracy Typically, they're physically mounted on a tripod. You might use them in lieu of a coordinate measuring machine to do 3D scanning. It's also used in archaeology, real estate. We're going to focus today on the mobile side, LiDAR that is mounted on moving platforms. We're going to break this down into two, this is very generic, high-level categories: mechanical LiDAR and solid-state LiDAR. Looking at a 360-degree field of view, which is the example that we have in the room here, is basically a vertical stack of lasers. The one that Velodyne created in 2006 was 64 channels. The laser that's shown here in the room is 128 channels. Many advantages to this. It's spinning 360 degrees, has very high accuracy with a very long range. It is scanning very fast, 10 and 20 hertz. It's 10 times a second or 20 times per second. It's mature. These things have been working for, again, 2006 for quite a while. Disadvantages are they're complicated to assemble. The components are expensive, making it just a high cost device, even though since the inception, maybe 20 years ago, the cost has gone down dramatically. Their durability is not sufficient for consumer grade automotive. We go to the second segment of a bridge now between mechanical and maybe a semi-solid state. What I'm really talking about on this slide is your automotive grade, the consumer grade vehicles, or LiDAR for vehicles. This is now, instead of a 360-degree field of view, we're looking at a more directional, typically 120 facing forward, maybe a 25 or more vertical field of view. Again, we have the same advantages. We're long range. We have excellent accuracy, but we're balancing that accuracy and precision with cost that the automotive OEMs are demanding. With this type of product, we're designing it for assembly, for automated assembly, not just assembly. This is past, our automotive grade that's showing here is past the PPAP of many different OEMs. And with electric vehicles, it has very low power consumption so that we're not draining range or reducing range when it's used on electric vehicles. The disadvantage, it really isn't a disadvantage. What I'm saying here is, you know, we could have a LiDAR that's going to meet the same performance as those spinning LiDARs that go for say 10 times the price, but that's just not going to cut it for the automotive applications. So what we prefer is to just say there's a balance. So again, what we're seeing here is just maybe a scan that goes left or right, or a scan that goes left or right, then also scans down. This is the 120-degree by 25-degree field of view of our automotive grade shown. The last example of LiDAR in terms of defining these types is a solid state LiDAR. What's happening with this is it's similar to maybe a camera where you have a flash of laser beams go out. It's typically an array that's emitted. It's covering whatever defined field of view using optical lenses. There are no moving parts. You do have a high precision we have a high level of precision and accuracy. With no moving parts, it's even easier to assemble. The cost is being driven down on that. At this time, with the level of electronic advancements, the range is somewhat limited. A unique point to make with this is I've got a LiDAR right here on my iPhone Pros, 14 Pros, and the iPads actually contain a LiDAR on them, and there's unique fun apps that you can download, and it merges, it fuses the camera with the LiDAR being developed. The purpose for the LiDAR on the phone is really to help out the camera in focusing, getting this distance of focus. What's the output of a LiDAR? It's called the point cloud. It's all of these millions of points that are being returned every second. This is a automotive grade, so this is 120 degrees, horizontal field of view, driving through a city. And what I want to highlight here is the complexity of the different colors. The reds are high intensity reflection objects, so those are typically road signs. You're seeing buildings here in the background, and I really want to highlight this, that building is visible through the LiDAR sensor having returns of laser energy, when up here in the actual camera, the corner of that building is blinded when you have the low horizon sun. So you're already starting to see some real good advantages of why LiDAR is good. The last thing to consider in developing LiDARs is, wait, we've got lasers. Are they safe? Yes. We make sure that they pass all the certifications for eye safety, things to consider in terms of the range that you want to sense, how much power is being consumed. 905, 940, 1550 are typically the wavelengths that are used there. Benefits are using LiDAR is you do have great accuracy. You can map with that. It's a 3D map, which is amazing. All different lighting environments are able to be sensed. The amount of data and direct speed measurements are superior. And Pepe was mentioning this at the break as well, though there is anonymity to this. In terms of privacy, you cannot detect faces. It doesn't have that resolution. Company overview of RoboSense has us founded in 2014, as I showed in the previous slides. We do have an IPO in progress in Hong Kong. We've got a team of research and development that's working on the hardware, which includes the optics and the mechanics and even the electrical hardware, the chips, the software side of it, the perception, which is an entire artificial intelligence applications of gathering all this data and labeling that you'll see here in a few minutes. This R&D also has in-house lab capabilities. 1,300 some employees. We have 700 engineers. We actually have a significant portion of that team that is designing our own chip so that we can be even more efficient and cost effective in the future. This team has a significant number of patents in all these different fields. We're IATF qualified, A-SPICE and CNAS. We're certified in all the quality systems to make us be a significant player in the automotive space with manufacturing in China. And we're looking to have the manufacturing here in North America to service our customers here. A little slice into the markets. I focus on automotive, and you're seeing some examples of LiDAR on the top of the vehicle. There's actually two on this one. This vehicle has the LiDAR tucked underneath the headlamps. Other applications that would be parallel, but would be these autonomous type transport vehicles and robots. The engineering team uses a lot of computer-aided engineering tools for systems and all the developments, optics included. From a lab side, we're really proud of our in-house lab that's certified. It is really a sight to behold in terms of having a lot of pride in our capabilities to control the quality and durability of our own products. We also have cooperations outside of our own lab for doing larger scale vehicular testing and evaluations. We have access to proving grounds with other cooperations, as well as our own fleet of vehicles that have driven 30 million kilometers around China and around the world with our LiDAR accumulating data. This is about a 30-second video that's actually, I don't believe this is sped up, but it's quite impressive in terms of the automation that I say this design for assembly is made. I show this in half speed to customers so that I can walk them through the precision and the pride of how we have confidence that we can have a very high level of OEE, overall equipment effectiveness, and turn out the volume of parts that our customers demand from an automotive perspective. This is what our, and I just looped back already. So you can see some of the key criteria. When you walk into one of these rooms, we're actually a class 10,000 clean room. This is probably nearing the medical type phase of being clean. You're blown off, you're put into the whole suits, and that's just a world-class type operation that we have. In terms of our North America strategy, our mission here in setting up our office in Plymouth, Michigan, which is about 20 minutes from Ann Arbor, was to grow the automotive footprint here in North America. To do that, we said we need to be able to manufacture in the region that the parts are going to be consumed. So RoboSense has had investors throughout its life so far. One of those investors is Luxshare, which is a significant supplier to Apple. Luxshare, after invest in us. Well, in 2018, they purchased an automotive supplier. They carved out body control systems from another larger company. In 2022, Luxshare and RoboSense formed LuxSense, a joint venture for manufacturing our parts. It's a nice complementary relationship, as Luxshare also manufactures components for Apple that have a lot of optical characteristics. Based on this relationship and really our parents being related, we're able to partner and have great relationships with BCS here in Farmington Hills, Michigan, right up the road, so that we can manufacture parts in North America and potentially in Europe for each of those regions going forward. Our product portfolio starts with the mechanical side of the hardware. You see the rotating, we talked about the automotive grade MEMS, as well as the flash LiDAR. perception side is interesting. The founder of the company received his PhD in 2013 in control science with a specific application of perception for outdoor environments of robotics. So we see a big revenue stream in both sides of both selling hardware, but also having the capabilities of perception. When we put these together, we also have the ability to combine them into complete systems. One of the key things that we look at is a reference system that is actually used by our customers to certify their other sensors on the vehicle. We're going to focus again on automotive grade. Quick snapshot. I'm going to breeze through this, but we have a ton of business within really Chinese OEMs. We're really proud to be on the Lucid Air. Just to start laying the context for this group here with the China focus of automotive futures, in the Shanghai Auto Show 23, 40 vehicles had LiDAR on them. 18 of those were RoboSense. We're really proud of that. In contrast, when my team, we walked through the Detroit Auto Show, we looked really close for LiDARs, and I think some of them were covered up. They might not have been ready for reveal, but there was one vehicle there because there was a Lucid that had ours on it. So there's just a significant difference right there in terms of the current state of LiDAR acceptance. So we talk about our hardware, it's all over the vehicles. The perception software is also something that we offer. Again, taking that point cloud, you're seeing objects that are starting to be boxed in and framed in with the camera to the side. What the perception software does, it helps us to detect. We take these point clouds, we group them together, we put a boxed environment around them, we can track them over time. We can start labeling them with artificial intelligence to say, based on this cluster of points, we have a motorcycle versus a car versus a pedestrian. We can track its size, we can track its speed, etc. We can also track the road environment, boundaries. We can ultimately driving with the result of free space. When you're driving autonomously, the key is where can you drive safely? That's defined as free space. Taking now a simple look at the AD and ADAS systems. From a very basic side, you have a lot of sensors that are trying to understand what's happening in the environment around the vehicle. Those sensors are populating, creating a bunch of data that needs to be analyzed with software, with algorithms that then communicate to the vehicle to decipher and determine what is it going to do, how is it going to control speed, steering, braking, etc. We're going to focus in a very high level the main sensors: LiDAR, camera, and radars. You're starting to see, you've seen the point clouds. We know what cameras can do. Radar is going to have its benefits in different environmental conditions, but also have its areas where it's not as good as a radar or a LiDAR. But again, what's happening on vehicles is customers, OEMs choose to integrate one, two, or all three of these into their vehicles. They fuse them together for a complete perception, to have the cognition to drive in whatever level that vehicle is going to drive in autonomously. Some of the requirements that we look at and how should a sensor perform, focusing on speed. I'm driving 75 mile an hour down the road and I want a comfortable braking distance. Math says we need 173 meters to do that. When you're looking at sensors that are sensing 200, 250 meters, you're starting to get a feel for where that criteria falls in. There's a lot of considerations in terms of how well a sensor does perform. Comparing these three different sensor types and basically taking a rating and putting the green pluses for the 4s and 5s in different shades. This is an independent research that I found through looking. And LiDAR has many benefits for, as we said, the 3D mapping, the detection range. Others may be superior by a slight level in terms of environmental conditions. But when you look at the color information, the camera, as you know, is very much like our eye. What's not listed on here is really the anonymity, the ability to have that privacy, which if you were to have one more row on this of anonymity, the LiDAR and radar are going to be pluses again, and the camera is going to have that one. Let's look at the market. What's very interesting is that in the early days of application of automotive grade LiDAR, you're only having one LiDAR per vehicle. These days, you're seeing 2s and 3s. In North America, we're only seeing one. Top range is growing to forecast to say you'd have 2 long range, forward and rearward facing, and then blind spot LiDARs on the side for 2032. you look at this market and the application of passenger car, consumer vehicles, and robo-taxis, driverless vehicles, you're looking at 5 or 6 LiDAR per robo-taxi, whereas your passenger cars today are 1 or 2 LiDARs. In the future, they're looking at putting 3 of them on there, maybe more. It's going to depend on each vehicle. The interesting slice is, as we look at today, there might be $20,000 worth of LiDAR on a robo-taxi. In the future, that's going to be cut down to about 1/3 is what the predictions are, this forecast. If we look at the passenger car, the consumer, the high volume ones, right now there's less than $1,000 of LiDAR, but there's only 1 LiDAR. Now, when you go forward and you look at 3 LiDARs on a car, the combined cost of all the LiDARs will be less than $1,000 per this prediction model. As we look at this context, this chart starts to lay the groundwork why China is so prevalent. They have been an early adopter of this technology, with having 106 car models to be released by 2023 or soon thereafter. Europe follows with around 6. We've got Japan, Korea, the other Asia areas at 4, and really in North America, it's fairly limited. It starts laying some of that groundwork. If we look at forecast, look at the sales. We got 20 million. We're just at this point where the sales are really starting to grow exponentially as being forecast. This is being driven a lot by those Chinese OEMs that are putting more than 1 LiDAR per vehicle. The model here shows that from 2022 is forecast to 2028 to have a 70% CAGR. It flattens out a little bit for this model out to 2033, but the revenue is nearing $4 billion by 2028. So that's a pretty attractive CAGR for investment. What has it been looking like? Well, you've got a bunch of people in the market. This is just a list of 50 LiDAR suppliers. If you go to CES, you're going to see LiDAR suppliers that aren't even on this list. And by the way, if you go to CES, we'll be there in the West Hall at booth 5127. We'd love to have you guys stop by and do some more demonstration and discussions. But the ecosystem is really large in terms of who is our competitors. But in terms of specific automotive applications here in North America, we're seeing these types of folks as in the competition set. Your Septons, the Ousters that are again the Velodyne acquisition. You can see them right there where North America is leading in terms of these suppliers, but China's picking up and Europe has a tight other second and third. With a 30% CAGR, the investment has been stellar, nearing $6 billion since 2016. 2020 and 2021 peaked this with over $3 billion in that 2-year period. 89% of this investment was through IPOs. The amount of money that's come in through the stock market is staggering. 2022, you've got 2 other suppliers that had some investments. A lot of that was to be able to have the ability to manufacture at scale to meet automotive demand. Earlier this year in February, about 2/3 of the 2023 value, this was per the end of May, another LiDAR supplier just went public. If we just take 2022 versus 2023, it's very interesting. It gives me a lot of pride to stand here and know the product that we have in the organization. There's a flip in market share ultimately. You've got some big players that their market share is dropping by nearly 15%. And who's picking that up? It's RoboSense and it's Hesai. And that has to do again with the growth and usage in the Chinese market. So comparing 2022 to 2023, significant increases in both of these. Hesai also is a Chinese LiDAR supplier, but looking at the design wins since 2018, really proud to put the RoboSense logo on here to show where we're at in terms of designing a design win that will have future revenue based on vehicles launching with that LiDAR. Again, this is for passenger cars. Another way to slice this competitive set is to look at the LiDAR manufacturer, then around the circle, which OEMs are using that LiDAR. It's interesting to see some OEMs, we talked about Leap Motor earlier, is in both categories. but the number of OEs picking up this utilization of these LiDARs is quite impressive. Just about on time here in terms of observations, kind of a conclusion here. LiDAR, as it relates to its adaptation, is quite amazing globally, but most importantly in China's usage. And what's amazing is there's such a strong technical base within the China group. I've been in meetings in California at customers, multiple meetings that have been taking place 100% in Mandarin in California, in San Francisco. It's really neat that RoboSense is able to provide that type of service globally and leverage that. Another observation, hey, there's a lack of, you got this product that's really growing. You know, if we look at that life cycle, you know, we're getting out of the introduction phase, but as it grows globally, there are no formal ISO standards for performing tests and definitions of performance criteria. That's something that's being worked on, but it can't come fast enough in my mind. I think in terms of the third bullet, you look at the vehicle, the location on the vehicle for a consumer. There's going to be a difference in each region as to where the optimal position is and where each OEM is going to accept that. When you go into the design domes here, in different areas, they're going to be restrictive on having it obvious that a LiDAR is present. They're going to want it much more discreet. So that's what we're seeing in terms of a very fun time for us to be more innovative about how we bring solutions to our customers. So those studio folks, they want them smaller. They want them the size of as small as you can get, 25 millimeters, you name it. Physics ends up being the restriction there. You've got to generate a certain amount of energy. You have optics that have to take place. You have speed to scan. You have a certain amount of data that has to be processed. So that just becomes a physical limitation. Another perspective for mine is in automotive, I've always had a product that passes an end-of-line test. It's good to ship. It goes in the vehicle, green light. For LiDAR, we calibrate after our end-of-line tests. We certify and we adjust. We make sure that this is going to perform properly. Once the LiDAR is installed on a vehicle, all the sensors get calibrated when they're fused together. You have a lot of anomalies, a lot of minor variations. And then the other side of it that RoboSense actually does a lot of work with our customers on is, now I've got a vehicle in for service at the dealer, and my LiDAR needs to be adjusted. How do they calibrate it? What is their mechanism to certify this vehicle is good to go back on the road? Another one, I talk about this amongst friends, you know, from an autonomous driving, in a whiteout blizzard, do you want to drive 50 mile an hour yourself, let alone an autonomous vehicle? What level of sensors do you need on a vehicle to perform under what conditions? What's realistic? The other idea is at minus 40, a lot of the usage of our LiDARs are in electric vehicles. You can run an electric vehicle at minus 40, but I think we all know that your range is going to drop that much faster. Well, that range is going to drop faster. I've got a LiDAR that can perform at that. We certify to it, but our power consumption is going to go up. The range goes down that much faster. Automotive is driving the cost out of LiDAR. There is that's just a given. We all know that's how the game works. But I think the key thing here is there's some anomaly. There's some noise maybe that LiDAR can send data and lose some of that privacy and stuff. As we said, there's anonymity to this, but also the content of the LiDAR is only communicating with the vehicle. The vehicle is the only thing that's going to communicate to the outside world. Geopolitical, I think Keith did a great job talking about some of these things in terms of various, restrictions that are rumored and talked about, both maybe coming out of China, going into China, coming into America. So those are all things that we continue to watch, and frankly, just like Keith, I'm curious to see what comes out of San Francisco yet today. And again, we're excited to be part of an industry that's growing in this life cycle and really taking out of its infancy and getting into maturity very, very fast. Thank you for your time and attention today.
So the first question has to deal with the how much are you guys grading yourselves in terms of hardware and software? How much where are you standing on that?
100% in-house. I guess from a chip side of things today, we're using chips that are off the shelf, you might say. automotive grade, but have the capability for our performance. But as I said earlier in the presentation, we also are developing our own SoC, our own system on chip that will enable our performance and to improve at a lower cost. Any more to add to that?
Sure. And I'm gonna add on a little bit on it because you can hear from a lot of earning costs, like especially recently Q3, you got some OEM company delay their projects, but in company like a RoboSense or some other, most Chinese company, it's hard to hear something delayed. And I would say it's more like a rolling improvement. We got some problem, let's do it. And then we find a problem, we solve it. So it's a continuous improvement process will be the key to RoboSense success so far. And like Ken talked about, semiconductor-driven AI perception software-driven is our in-house intellectual property. And when Ken talked about 1,000 patents, and a lot of portion of those patents are registered with U.S. Government also.
Very good, thank you. You mentioned you were designing your own chips. Now, who will manufacture those chips, and where will those chips be manufactured?
That's a great question. You must be from an OEM, because that's the same. You know, for us to succeed, we are very transparent with our customers. That's a guaranteed price of entry that we want to honor with our customers. We will have a fab and a finish house do our SoC. I think in this forum, it's not relevant to disclose that level of transparency, but certainly in terms of the actual source, the site of that will likely be in the Asia area for the manufacture of that chip. Yeah.
How have the Chinese companies been able to afford to put as much LiDAR on their vehicles as you guys were describing? Like that's one of the questions that you know, the companies, I'm sure when you're dealing with manufacturers, you're always dealing with cost controls and how much do things cost, and et cetera. How are the Chinese able to afford to be able to put that many on their vehicles?
I'll take this question because some other friends ask us how many LiDAR are you going to put in one vehicle? We say from 1 up to 6. And also Keith talked about why people are building new plants instead of using the old one. It's like when you buy a house, you're going to do a renovation or build a new one from a land, right? So people always use cost and benefit analysis method in making those decisions. But in China, the major difference, if you talk about, in fact, last year, the US EV sales is about 760,000, but in China it was 5.9 million. EV or battery vehicle is a great soil for autonomous driving or driving systems, and which is have a full utilize of LiDAR system. So I would say this is why it costs different. And also in China, if you talk about, we see a very interesting chart too. For each brand, who make the most money might be Tesla for each vehicle. And if you talk about some other brand, it all varies because of different cost structure and the cost of sales. So as I would say, in China, the major thought for the difference how we market those advanced driving system would be, we want to consumer know it first, and sometimes we use a subscription as a service model to make money in the future. Is speak of those EV company in China. So it's very different marketing mindset. And RoboSense boom is driven by those marketing, but for those autonomous driving system, marketing start from this year. Those Chinese EV companies. That's it.
Just add one other point to Pepe's note in terms of the volume, number of pieces per vehicle. Scale is a big factor in terms of being able to drive that price down. You get scale at purchase sizes at tooling cavitations, but primarily in electronics industries. We all know as you get the scale of components, it drives out. It also pays off that investment for the automated assembly. We have modular designs as well, so that as we upgrade in performance from one series to another within the same physical architecture, it's a plug and play replacement. We're just swapping out a component, a chip or something on a circuit board that allows us to improve performance with very little unique investment.
Speaking of cost, How does your automotive cost for LiDAR compare to a camera vision system?
That's a great question. You know, when you look at the different types of LiDAR, you got the flash, you got the semi-solid state, cost proportionate. What are you thinking?
I can take that question.
Go ahead.
It really depends on take rate. So when OEM calculate per vehicle cost, they combine those take rate. For camera, mostly are 100% take rate. But right now, the EV who launched those system with LiDAR is maybe 20% or 15% take rate. It really depends on how commercialized LiDAR is. So comparatively, the take rate combined with the scale for putting LiDAR or camera on, it could be equal. It really depends on how you build up the vehicle cost case on that. So
Very good, thank you. When will your IPO in Hong Kong launch?
it's already public information. We actually submit the application to Hong Kong Stock Exchange in June this year, and there is process to follow, and we can only answer so far right now for this topic. But definitely going public is a very good route for RoboSense globalization, and our global customer need those transparency from RoboSense. When we are talking to OEM here, we talk about financial data. Is that transparent? How you get those data? How you calculate? If you're a public company, it's more easy to answer to get those same treatment as other global company when we're bidding some projects. For business level, it's really helpful. Yeah. And for RoboSense corporate level, we got more funds. Our current investor need a return on investment. So going to public, that it's definitely a return on their investment too, and for a faster growth of RoboSense in future.
All right, last question for you. And this is a tricky one because it's something I'm sure you can answer, but what are the things that need to be standardized or the definitions of performance that you mentioned? Because there were no ISOs, none of those things. What areas in particular do you think are areas that need to be?
I can feel this from the level of engineering capabilities that I have, but a lot of it has to do with standardization of angular resolution and detection range. A lot of times we will say we have a sensor that's 200 meters at 10% NIST. That means it's got a 10% reflectivity target. And we have, now that's usually at a straight on position. When you have a field of view that might go 120 degrees left or right, what's that same distance? The complexities of the performance and the field of view drive some uniqueness in terms of the performance, and therefore, how do you standardize that? Is it a certain level of accuracy and resolution at the extreme angles of the LiDAR? Those are some examples that I think can help paint that picture that we found to be nuances maybe, and things we just need to explain to our customers. Here's why we perform in this level.
And if there's other questions that you ask, they're going to be around for luncheon. So feel free to ask questions during that. Thanks again to Ken and Pepe. Our next and last group of speakers are from the U.S. International Trade Commission. David Coffin is a senior international economist at the commission. The commission is part of the Office of Industry Competitiveness and Analysis, where he covers the automotive industry and is responsible for motor vehicle sector. He joined USITC in June 2019 as a presidential management fellow. David's research publications have primarily focused on the automotive supply chain, with publications on the EV supply chain, Chinese entry in the U.S. supply chain, and used vehicles. David received his MA in International Affairs from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in 2010, with concentrations in international economics and China studies. Prior to attending graduate school, David spent 2 years in China teaching English and studying Chinese in the cities of Shanghai and Hangzhou. David received his BA in political science from Lee University in 2006. Jeff Walling, his colleague, is an international economist at the office, at the commission, where he covers the automotive industry as well. He joined the USITC in September 2012 and spent 4 years in the Office of Economics before moving into his current role in 2016. His current work focuses on the electrification of the automotive industry, as well as automotive supply chains, trade in used vehicles, and policies and regulations impacting automotive trade. Jeff received his MA in International Trade and Investment Policy from the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University in 2014, and his BAs in Economics and Political Science from the University of Florida in 2012. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to virtually be here. So we're going to be talking to you all about Chinese EV trade over the last few years and reasons for growth. Before we get started, a little bit about Jeff and I. As Bruce mentioned, we're from the U.S. International Trade Commission. The USITC has a few different roles in U.S. trade, some anti-dumping and countervailing duty work, some in the intellectual property space. However, what Jeff and I primarily focus on is trade policy analysis in support of policymakers in the legislative and executive branch. We follow the automotive industry and focusing on trade, production, and competitiveness. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is adapted from a forthcoming article in the Journal of International Commerce and Economics, which is kind of a series of articles that we've done looking at the EV battery supply chain and EV trade. Just to be clear, the views expressed here are our own, and they're not necessarily those of the Commission or any of its commissioners. Quick roadmap of where we're going to go today. We're going to start off. I'm going to talk to you about Chinese EV trade trends and give a brief 2023 update on what trade in 2023 is looking like. And then I'm going to pass it over to Jeff, who's going to talk about some of the reasons for growth post-2020 and why those exports have not gone to the United States. Some of this may have some overlap with some of the earlier presentations like Bruce's and Keith's. We'll try to point out the synergies as we get there. So Chinese EV trade trends, the highlights of this aren't really a surprise to anyone. EV production in China has grown rapidly, as we discussed earlier, and EV exports have followed. However, what's a little more interesting that we'll get into is how the Chinese EVs' improved quality has led to higher unit prices and a change in destination mix. And then I'll talk a little bit about EV batteries. Happy to talk more about that later if there's questions. We focus mainly on vehicles in the presentation itself. So real quick, big picture, looking at Chinese EVs, you see the sales numbers. You see that the humongous production numbers for China, it's well ahead of the EU or the United States. And as of the last couple of years, it's also ahead in exports. That's a relatively new phenomenon. You also notice the really small import number, which is partially due to the tariff that was discussed earlier, and partially due to a lot of the companies already producing in China. Next slide, please. So Chinese EV production, you can see it's really skyrocketed over the last couple of years since 2020. It's important to note that really even from 2018 to 2020, the EV production was tops in the world. And so this increase isn't to pass anyone, it's actually reaching the top level. It's increasing beyond everyone else. Excuse me for a second. I need to close the door. I'm getting a lot of background noise. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you all were hearing that, but I was getting a lot of background noise. Next slide, please. Chinese EV exports showed a similar pattern from 2018 to 2022. It's important to note that that 2018 to 2020 set of numbers was not a global leading number on exports. It was actually behind the United States and Germany. But you really saw a big change in 2021 and 2022, not only in terms of the volume of exports, but also as a share of Chinese vehicle exports. That number passing 30% means it's has about a 50% larger share of Chinese vehicle exports than it does share of vehicle production in China. So the EVs in China appear to be more competitive on the global stage than Chinese vehicles as a whole. Some of the reasons for that were discussed earlier, and we'll discuss them a little more now. On the ICE side, I think one of the things that was discussed earlier was you have a lot of those joint ventures, and maybe those joint venture, the foreign partner in the joint venture stage may not be as interested in exporting. Jeff will explain why perhaps EVs are a little different a little later on. Next slide, please. So with this increase in exports has also come a change in the destination mix. So in 2018, there's a wide geographical range and also income range in the top 5 destinations for Chinese EVs. However, you see in 2022, it shifted to 4 out of 5 being from Europe, and all 5 are high-income countries. So that's a real shift in where Chinese EVs are going. And digging a little deeper on the next slide, you can see that as a whole, high-income exports to high-income countries have increased dramatically over the last 3 years. In 2018, 2019, and 2020, the leading destinations for Chinese EV exports were lower middle-income countries. That volume hasn't gone away, but you've seen high-income countries as an increasing share of the exports and receiving their own volume. I think that points to something that was being discussed a little bit earlier, which is about the new plants coming online in China. It's those new plants producing new EVs that are getting exported to high-income countries. It's not the old plants that were producing older EVs. Those are, I would guess, just looking at this data, and Jeff will go into more detail, but I would guess that those are the same EVs that were going in 2018, 2019, and 2020 to lower middle income countries are still going in 2021 and 2022. It's just now you have newer, nicer EVs, I wouldn't necessarily use that word, but more expensive, destined for higher income markets. And if you look at the next slide, you see that there's a similar story in terms of unit prices from 2017 to 2019. So this one, we actually went a year farther back. I meant to cut that back off at 2018 and forgot. This shows the picture well, that it was under $5,000 per unit was the average value. If you take the total value of Chinese EV exports and divide it by the number of units, this is the unit price. So that means a lot of those EVs were very low cost. My guess would be it wouldn't really be what we would consider on-road motor vehicles, more your neighborhood electric vehicles. You might see some of those on campus, for campus security and stuff like that, or gator type things with electric motors. But starting in 2020 and then continuing into 21 and 22, the unit prices really shot up. They're still significantly below unit values of, say, US EV exports, which are more like $50,000. And in fact, in 2017 and 2018, they were more like $70,000. So the unit price for US EVs has actually gone in the other direction as we've begun to produce more affordable EVs, but there's still a significant gap where the EVs being produced in the US are significantly more expensive and higher end than the average unit prices from the Chinese. Though I would guess that if you could see the distribution of costs of the EVs being exported from the US and the cost of EVs being sold exported from China, there would be some overlap between the cheaper US models and the more expensive Chinese models. Next slide, please. So real quick on batteries, it was briefly mentioned earlier. I think Keith mentioned it in terms of battery overcapacity, perhaps being a thing. I think that I believe that as well. I think Keith had a really good point about how, in a growing space, you can't necessarily be sure what is overcapacity. I'll talk about this slide in a minute, but it's good to be aware that currently Chinese battery capacity represents about 75% of global EV battery capacity. And despite all of the investment that I'm sure you all have heard about in the United States and the EU to increase EV battery capacity, the Chinese share of EV battery capacity by 2027 is only going to drop from 75% to 70% because Chinese investment is continuing at nearly as quick of a pace as in the US and the EU. So Chinese lithium-ion battery capacity is going to be very large. And if the EV conversion doesn't come fast enough, it would certainly be overcapacity. Jeff and I project that assuming the announced investments in the United States reach full capacity, whether that's 2027 or a couple of years later, at that point, you probably actually have enough capacity in the United States for meeting US demand. There's a lot of variables in there. And it would be to meet US demand at about 9 or 10 million units for 60 kilowatt hour batteries, which as batteries get larger, they require more. And so maybe it wouldn't be enough exactly, but it's certainly heading in that direction. And the EU, I think there's similar projections. And so then you start wondering where that EV battery capacity in China would be for. But enough about battery capacity. I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to talk to you. Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more slide. I forgot. The 2023 update. I usually focus on full year data, but I think in this case, it's important to note that even looking at partial year data, Chinese EV exports are beyond their exports from last year. Just January to September has about 200,000 more units than China exported all of last year. So we're likely to see Chinese exports at more like 1.5 million units this year, which, it's part of the global growth of EV production and sales, but it's also a huge number. And many of you might have seen the articles about China actually passing not only being the top EV exporter, but this year they're projected to be the top vehicle exporter globally for the first time ever. And that is really on the back of EV exports. So with that, I will pass it over to Jeff to go into some of the reasons why.
Yeah, thanks, David. And like David said, thank you so much for inviting us. This has been a really informative discussion, and I will hopefully wrap things up for the day. So if David's job was to kind of walk everyone through what the data is showing about Chinese EV exports, my job is then to kind of think through the why. And really, there's three things that David and I attribute to the change in Chinese EV exports, and specifically the EU as a destination market in recent years. So the first one is the existence of Tesla's plant in Shanghai. I'll touch on this more on the next slide, but just for anyone who doesn't know, that's where they service the EU market from. And Tesla's exports actually make up nearly half of all Chinese EV exports, which is just a fact that a lot of people don't normally stop and think about. Like, we hear this narrative that it's, these Chinese headquartered companies like BYD that are going to be the ones with the largest foothold, whenever that entry into the US market hypothetically occurs, but at least right now playing out in the data, Tesla is the #1 exporter coming out of China. The second factor that I'll walk through is a bunch of EU market characteristics that maybe just make them a more appealing or a more logical market than, say, the United States, for example, which is another logical question to ask, especially when David is, pointing out that China's exports are now disproportionately going to high-income countries, but we still fail to see the entry into the US market, at least, thus far. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of just what the composition of Chinese EV manufacturers looks like and what the developments have been. The session two sessions ago touched on this in even more detail, so I'll try to be really brief. But there's kind of a variety of things going on. There are the aforementioned quality improvements. There's also the loosening of various JV requirements, which is probably having an impact for the non-Chinese owned manufacturers. And then lastly, there's the elephant in the room, the alleged Chinese government subsidies, which I'll touch on a little bit as well. But first, so for anyone who doesn't know, Tesla opened a gigafactory much like the one in Sparks, Nevada, in Shanghai back in 2019. It has a current capacity of about 750,000 units, which is the largest gigafactory that Tesla operates. It actually makes up more than a majority of their total production last year. And like I said earlier, that's where they typically meet demand for the EU market. So the majority of Teslas on road in the European Union are coming from China. That's also where Tesla services like the Chinese market and a variety of other markets. But it's important to understand that a Tesla being driven in the European Union is highly unlikely to have originated from its production facilities in the United States. And then lastly, so the most recent data that we could find was the first half of 2022. But in that 6-month period of time, Tesla's exports from China make up about 48% of all Chinese EV exports. So approximately 1 out of every 2 electric vehicles being exported from China was a Tesla in the first half of 2022. That's just something that people typically, I think, wouldn't believe if you weren't looking at the data like David and I were. So then, I think a logical question to ask is, okay, so why? What makes the EU so special? And specifically, why not the United States, at least thus far? And there's really 3 different things going on there. One, Tesla already has significant US production, which is something different from the majority of the European market. Just generally speaking, when we talk about automotive goods, that there's 2 ways to service a market. You can either invest in the country and set up production in that country, or you can export from some larger manufacturing hub. And typically in sort of the academic literature, there's a tipping point, a certain number of units at which it makes sense to set up a new production facility. But for whatever reason, right, this is Tesla's strategy right now. The US vehicles are typically coming from the Fremont, California facility, which gets batteries from Sparks, or the Austin, Texas facility, which is where the Model Y and soon the Cybertruck will be produced out of. But again, a European Tesla is coming from China, which is a pretty big difference. And then lastly, or secondly, rather, there's just a difference in EV demand. I'll touch on this on the next slide, but demand for electric vehicles in Europe is right now significantly ahead of the United States, even with the increased interest by US consumers. And then kind of flipping that on its head, there's also a major supply side constraint, which is the difference in the US tariff rate on Chinese EVs compared to the European tariff rate. So looking first at the demand side of things, so this gives you US and EV sales over the same 5-year period that David and I have been using throughout our presentation. And I think the main takeaway here should be that in 2018, there were actually more US sales of electric vehicles than there were European sales. And then the number flipped, and it hasn't flipped back since then. And in 2022, the US closes the gap a little bit. But in 2020 and 2021, EU sales actually double US sales. And even in 2022, I say they closed the gap, but there's still, the delta is about 370,000 more electric vehicles sold in the European Union than in the United States. So if you have 2 markets and one of them seems to be more interested in electric vehicles, right, there's a logical choice there that if you have to pick and choose what markets you're entering, at least the order in which you're entering them, the European market just might seem like a more appealing destination for some Chinese companies right now. Flipping it and talking more about the supply constraint, I'm going to get a little in the weeds here on tariff policy for a moment for anyone who isn't familiar, but typically, historically speaking, the MFN rate, which is the rate that you would pay to import a product for electric vehicles in the United States, was 2.5% compared to 10% in the European Union. So it was cheaper to pay the import cost to import an electric vehicle into the US market from China or anywhere else compared to the European Union. However, a couple of years ago, during the Trump administration's presidency, we started something called Section 301 tariffs, which specifically target China and target a variety of goods. This is not automotive specific. This isn't even manufacturing specific. But on, I would say, most products, to be frank, there is an additional tariff. It's typically 25%. There's a few exceptions to that, but I won't get that far into the weeds on Section 301. But as long as Section 301 is in place, there is an additional 25% duty to import a Chinese electric vehicle or any other good on the Section 301 lists, which means that for now, the cost of importing an electric vehicle from China into the United States is 2.5 times the cost of importing one into Europe in terms of the duties that the importer would have to pay. That's a significant barrier. I mean, like David's talking about unit cost per vehicle earlier, and when you're talking about deltas of $5,000, $10,000, a really good way to drown that out is to take a $25,000 vehicle and then levy a tariff that's equal to more than a quarter of that cost on top of the price of the vehicle. So I don't really think that can be overstated enough. But then, okay, so turning back to Europe, I think the final thing to think about is, so who's actually doing the exporting? And we've talked a lot about Tesla to date, so I'll kind of table them for this slide, but there's really 3 groups of companies that we think you should think about when you're talking about Chinese exporters of electric vehicles. One is you have the existing Chinese brands that are probably familiar to anyone with expertise about the Chinese automotive market, but those are companies like BYD, Aura, which is a subsidiary of Great Walls Motors. Great Walls is probably the more familiar company for a lot of people. And then companies like MG and Rowe, which are just existing brands that have been operating, out of China, but in the EU market for a long time now. And then you have Chinese-owned startup brands like Awei, Neo, and Xiaopeng, which are, I would say, newer names, but names that are out there and have volume and are participating in like things like the Chinese Auto Show and things of that nature. And then lastly, you have these US and European brands. In addition to Tesla, Renault, BMW are both JVs that have Chinese owners. But maybe the unique thing about them is that in BMW's case, it's a company called BMW Brilliance, which is a 75-25 ownership, where BMW has 75% ownership in the company. In Renault's case, it's 50-50, but the rules for that JV are such that Renault has the controlling interest despite it being a 50-50 split. And I think the interesting thing there is that they're the exporters. The other JVs where the Chinese side of the JV is the controlling interest, you don't see the same export propensity, at least currently in the data. So with that, I think it's just sort of worth noting moving forward that it may not be all sunshine and rainbows, even just in the European market for Chinese companies. The European Commission announced in October of this year, so a month and a half ago, that it was opening what's called an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese EVs. The case was launched ex officio, which is the technical term for when a government initiates its own anti-subsidy investigation instead of it being initiated by companies operating in that market. If anyone is familiar with like US trade policy, this is similar to the US countervailing duty case process, in which again it's typically companies that initiate, but in some rare instances the US government has moved forward with a case that it has launched itself. So this is sort of the European equivalent to those rarer cases. The case is based on something called the threat of injury rather than already documented harm, which most ADCVD experts believe is an effort to avoid a repeat of an experience that the EU had about a decade ago, in which they refrained from starting these types of investigations regarding solar panels. And despite eventually initiating an anti-subsidy case and ruling in favor of the domestic industry, the domestic industry failed to really recover. And I think people who are pro-Europe in that discussion would say that the Chinese industry had already done the harm that it was going to do prior to the case being launched. So just kind of how these cases work, they typically take about a year. And the way trade law works, the European Commission is going to need to prove three things. One, that exporters of China-made cars have received countervailing subsidies from the Chinese government, which is an accusation that the Chinese government denies, as Ken alluded to earlier. Second, that Europe's industry is under imminent threat of injury from those subsidies. And then three, that there's a causal link between those two things. If they rule affirmatively, there will be countervailing duties levied against Chinese EV imports, which will increase the cost of importing an EV into Europe. So you'd be talking about a situation where the delta in this graphic gets smaller because it will no longer be a 10% tariff to import an EV into the European Union. What exactly that tariff rate is anyone's guess at this point. There's no concrete number that, if the case is ruled affirmative, the tariff has to be X percent. But I would say the only thing we sort of know for sure is that countervailing duty, or in the European terminology, anti-subsidy cases typically result in lower tariffs than their anti-dumping counterparts, which is the more severe action that a government can take of the two types of trade remedy cases that you can take in international courts. So, how this resolves is something that we will have to touch on at Automotive Futures 2024, but it could signal a pretty significant change in the Chinese involvement in the EU market in terms of electric vehicles. So the last thing I'll touch on, David and I just kind of always do this at the end of any talk we're giving, and these links work in the slide deck version that Bruce has to upload to the website for the event. But this is just a kind of a compendium of all of the related research coming out of staff at the USITC. So we have things on the EV and EV supply chain that are largely David and I, but also the third member of our automotive team and some other analysts. But we also have a plethora of research on critical minerals that go into EV batteries, and a smattering of other Chinese automotive topics that aren't just electric vehicles. So like I said, all of these links should work. The only thing that's not here is the forthcoming paper that David mentioned at the beginning. But if you would like to have access to that whenever it's available, these are David and I's email addresses. We're happy to make sure that we can get you anything that you might be interested in, or just talk about automotive trade more generally. But with that, I will say thank you, and I will turn it back over to Bruce.
Thank you very much, guys. Very well done. Great info on what's going on. Got some questions for you. First of all, who does the commission report to? How does it relate to the U.S. Trade Representative?
Oh, we should have covered that at the beginning. Yeah, so the quick elevator speech about the ITC. So we are an independent federal agency. We're one of the few federal agencies that does not directly report to one of the three branches of government. But in those fact-finding investigations, the majority of what David and I's part of the commission do, the way it typically works is either the legislative branch, by ways of Senate Finance or House Ways and Means, the two subcommittees, can submit a request to us for a report, or the executive branch by way of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So we create studies and do these investigations at the request of the legislative branch or the executive branch. But the way the laws are written, and kind of the caveat that everyone knows, is if you ask the ITC for a study, we do the study independent of what your policy interest in the question might be. So we don't make policy. And if someone asks us for a study, they kind of understand that they may not necessarily be in complete alignment with the results, if that makes sense.
Okay, very good. Thank you. The cost issues that you were talking about in terms of the cost of the EVs that were being exported, right? You know, it looks like at most they were $25,000, which is in the U.S. world are pretty inexpensive vehicles. How does that compare to the EV prices in the EU? You know, if they're exporting to the EU and they're how do their prices on EVs, you know, which is probably what raised the issue in the first place, is that they felt that that their prices were so low that, you know, their local manufacturers were not going to be able to meet it, right?
Yeah, so one of the important things to know with the unit price data that we were using is it was aggregated. So that 20-something thousand number that you saw on the slide included both kind of that really inexpensive volume that was going elsewhere, and then the higher value stuff that was going to the EU. But I think you hit the nail on the head that the lower cost of the Chinese EVs being exported is a part of the issue. One of the other things to know about trade data and unit prices is it's the cost of the EV and not the retail price. So there can be a significant gap. Oddly enough, the place where I know the most about the gap is in clothing. If you were to look at similar unit prices on, say, like a collared shirt like this, you'd see that the average unit price of a collared shirt imported in the US is like $5. And that's because it's really just the cost of the shirt. And there's no interest on the importer of inflating that value because they pay taxes based on the value of what they're importing. I did actually start pulling up unit prices for individual countries. And once you start looking at the individual countries, you know, for Denmark in 2022, the unit value was $30,000. For Norway, it was $44,000. So I think for some of those European countries, the gap's a lot smaller when you're actually looking at the types of EVs that are being exported to the EU. I'm pretty sure there is still a gap, though.
We have in the forthcoming paper that we've now mentioned twice, we have a stat. We looked at EU imports of all electric vehicles and then broke out China from the rest of the sources that are sending vehicles to the European Union. And the number is that in 2022, the average cost of a Chinese import was about $9,600, while the average import from elsewhere is about 30. So to David's point, like, I think there's still a big delta between unit prices and trade data versus the sticker price of a car, you know, in a retail lot, but a bit more of an apples to apples comparison, Bruce, that like there's a potentially $20,000 difference.
Yeah. Thank you. Why so many Tesla exports to the EU? Why aren't they have a plant in Berlin?
I'm not sure it was operational in those first couple of years. So I think that was a big part of it. Is it operational now, the Berlin plant?
Pretty sure.
Yeah. So that's something that you may see going down. So maybe in 2023, those numbers will look a little different.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Yeah. Can you say more about Chinese EV production numbers and how many of those are light duty vehicles versus smaller vehicle types?
I don't know that we can. So I'm going to get real trade nerd on everyone for a minute, but in international trade data, cars are typically split by like engine size or weight, depending on the variety of vehicle. So like we can typically differentiate between like a small car and a big car, or a car and a pickup truck. But as it is currently delineated, they added categories to the end of those that is just vehicle propelled by electric motor. So the EVs do not have all of the same subcategories. We can split up, David, chime in here if you're thinking of something I'm not, but we can split pickup trucks up from everything else because trucks have their own category. And 870380, which is where passenger cars are located, is certainly the majority of imports. But splitting up that, which could be everything from like a Prius up to an electric SUV, is there aren't categories for those right now.
Ah, okay.
You asked about production though.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have a bunch of spreadsheets open and I know it's here somewhere. Somewhere we have the production data, and the data from CAM, the China Automotive Association. I think they have a similar breakout to what Jeff was saying. It has light duty, not light duty. It has cars, and then like light duty vehicles that includes pickup trucks to like medium trucks, and then I think they separate out buses.
Yeah.
So while we answer your next question, I'll find the spreadsheet.
All right. Let's talk IRA. IRA incentives for EVs. Would vehicles using Chinese batteries made in the US qualify for incentives?
That is a good question. The foreign entity of concern exclusion that I think is what you're referencing in the Inflation Reduction Act, it says specifically that batteries produced by a foreign entity of concern or containing content from a foreign entity of concern, so this could include the critical minerals or components, wouldn't be eligible. However, the US government has not yet officially defined foreign entity of concern for the Inflation Reduction Act. People have assumed that China would be a part of that foreign entity of concern list because other foreign entity of concern lists put out by Homeland Security include China. I think that's probably a good guess. But as you're aware, it gets more complicated because, you know, if you're talking about a battery produced by CATL in China, I think it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to get incentives for that. However, as many of you there are likely aware, Goshen is producing a plant in Michigan, or unless that got voted down by local. I know that there is some local pushback on that one.
Yeah, it's still working through that, I think.
And then CATL has the licensing deal with Ford. My guess, and this is a guess, you know, the regulations haven't come out yet, and there's some real complicated discussions in terms of what percentage of Chinese ownership would be acceptable, and if there's ownership structures that would work. My guess would be that even the Goshen plant, it would be pretty hard to access IRA incentives, but it's possible with the Ford plant that they would be able to, assuming that the licensing agreement is judged to be separated enough that it's not paying a foreign entity of concern. I know that there has been, I think Senator Rubio spoke very specifically about the CATL plant, that he didn't see that as being different enough and going against the intent of the law. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, but that's definitely getting into the legal space there, and a very, very complex area. And I would also highlight that while Goshen and CATL are much more in the news, this is actually much more of a concern farther upstream. You know, Keith talked about Chinese dominance in the upstream in terms of mineral processing and EV battery components. And that's really where the rubber's going to meet the road in terms of this foreign entity of concern issue. Because for things like natural graphite, which is what is used for anodes, and for a lot of the other upstream components, China is responsible for about 70-80% of the production capacity globally for those. So it becomes really difficult to produce EV batteries without having minerals processed in China or components purchased from China. I think IRA is going to certainly incentivize changing that, but it's certainly looking like it might be a challenge in the near term.
Yeah, and then I'll just add, this isn't IRA related, but a different policy that's also at the forefront of automotive producers right now, the USMCA agreement. So among other things, it has a list of 7 core parts, and the parts are subject to various rules, an RVC requirement about the portion of the good that is made in North America, as well as a labor value content requirement and some other miscellaneous rules of origin for those. And one of the core part is the advanced battery. So I think if you put, USMCA and IRA together, like, it's very obvious to understand what at least the intent is, and the intent is to have, batteries produced in North America or ideally in the United States. Now, if you had an automotive company on your agenda for today, like, it's very likely that they might tell you that some people think there is a delta between what policymakers decided is a good idea and what actually is feasible or practical or even possible. So, how those things will all play out as we get into 2027 and full IRA compliance is anyone's guess. But I think it would be difficult to have a battery produced in China that qualifies for USMCA and qualifies for the IRA.
Yeah. Which brings us to this next question, which is, we've haven't had a chance to talk about Mexico. And there have been other Mexico questions today, but we haven't had a chance to get to them. Now, here we're not talking about batteries, and we're not necessarily talking about EVs, but should we expect to see Chinese vehicles entering the U.S. market from Mexico? And would additional tariffs be added?
It depends is the economist lawyer answer. I think you and I talked yesterday that I don't think there's a large Chinese plant currently in Mexico. This is actually a trend that we've seen in a number of other industries. Like if you look at televisions, and actually if you look upstream in the automotive industry, you see this as well, that final assembly for a lot of brakes that are assembled in Mexico actually have a large amount of Chinese content. And then the final assembly occurs in Mexico. So then they don't face the same tariff issues as an import from China. They may still pay the 2.5% tariff because the Chinese content's too high to qualify for free trade status, but it is significantly cheaper than if it was assembled in China. And you see that from everything from brakes to televisions. And so you could see something similar with Chinese vehicles, particularly with the battery overcapacity issue that we've been talking about. You could be assembling EVs in Mexico with Chinese batteries that would be helping with that potential battery overcapacity in China. The EVs wouldn't be eligible for USMCA because, like Jeff mentioned, they would have Chinese batteries, but it would still take the tariff burden that they were facing from 27.5% down to 2.5% if you were talking about a car or SUV. Speaking of cars or SUVs, it turns out I had combined the data in my spreadsheet because we were interested in the aggregated number. But the China Association of Automobile Manufacturers does publish EVs in terms of, they separate it in terms of passenger cars and commercial vehicles. I would have to dig into the definitions, but I think the pickup trucks that we tend to think of as more of a passenger vehicle in the United States would actually fall under commercial vehicle in that Chinese definition. So it's probably, those commercial vehicles range from pickup trucks all the way up to buses. But that's about 34.2 times 10,000 is 342,000 units last year in the commercial vehicle part, and 5.1 million in the passenger car space in terms of BEVs. And, you know, as you're aware, a large portion of that commercial vehicle space in China is buses. They have really been in the lead in terms of battery electric vehicle buses. BYD, who actually, again, as we talked about yesterday, has been producing those buses in the US for a number of years as well.
Very good.
Going back to your Mexico question, just something that I want to add, because I think it's obvious to David and I, but it's not obvious to someone who doesn't look at trade data every day. So when you talk about, you know, a Chinese export from Mexico, just making sure that kind of whoever asked the question is on the same page with us. If let's just use a U.S. example for a minute, a BMW produced in South Carolina that is then exported to Canada because someone in Toronto wants to buy a BMW. That is not a German export to Canada. That is a US export to Canada, regardless of the fact that it originated with BMW, who is a European company. So, at least from a trade data standpoint, if a Chinese company opens a manufacturing facility and is producing vehicles in Mexico, those will be Mexican exports to the United States. Now, sorry. There are instances in international trade law, especially since the imposition of Section 301 tariffs, where Chinese production of a good has suddenly been in Taiwan and it's all the same producers, and the trade flow seems like it has just moved south a little bit. And there have been some litigation in cases surrounding that and the imposition of tariffs on what is now the Taiwanese exporter, but the same Chinese nameplate or Chinese brand. So that's not to say that there isn't anything that U.S. policymakers could do about something like that if it is clearly to try to overt the 25% tariff that you would face exporting something from China. But just as a general matter, what matters is where the good was produced, not where the firm was headquartered.
Very good. A couple of clarification issues here from the audience. Tesla's Gigafactory in Berlin only produces the Model Y, and one Model Y version for sale in Europe is produced in Shanghai, and all European Model 3s are made in Shanghai. Hence, it's probably not going to change until Berlin starts making Model 3s. Now that's probably what. And the other thing I wanted to ask you guys, when you talk about EVs throughout your presentation, you include PHEVs in the EVs?
Oh, no, yeah, that's a good distinction. I noticed that this morning when you were kind of setting the stage for everyone. That is something that you can differentiate in the trade data. There is a separate category where data is recorded for vehicles that are propelled by both an engine and an electric motor. We've separated that out. It's noted in like really clearly in a footnote up front in our paper, but all of the trade data and where possible the production and sales data for today, we were just talking about fully electric vehicles. Yeah.
Very good. All right, I'm going to let you guys go. I'm going to let us have lunch. There's still a lot of good questions, but we'll do it for another day.
Well, feel free to reach out to us. We really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you all have a good lunch.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Have a great one, everyone.
All right. Let's close this 16th annual Inside China Automotive Conference down. As we usually do, and as we know we have to because we want to, thank our affiliates. We'll thank them for the support that they give us. We couldn't do our conferences without them. So a big thank you to them. Our next conference is in February on what we're calling the coming or the new automotive supply chain, and we'll be focusing on particularly on environmental sustainability as opposed to some of the other pieces of the ESG story. It's going to be pretty much focused on the environment. We've talked about this before, about how challenging it is to understand where all the components and the small pieces of components that go into vehicles, how they're created, and all the environmental connections to them. And so we're going to spend the conference looking at some of those issues and how can companies still be profitable and still be able to meet these goals. Again, thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.